Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today is February the 6th, 2023, and we are here to talk about the world with Agent Smith. Smith. Without any further delay, I will jump into the voice channel and we will talk about what's going on in the world with Agent Smith. Smith. Hello, sir.
Hello.
Yo.
How are you today?
I'm doing well. Got to do some real-life board games yesterday.
Did you win?
Yes, we made good progress. It's sort of a campaign-style game, so we didn't beat the campaign yet, but we're probably a third of the way through completing it. And
I think you mentioned that one before.
Yeah, Kingdom Death is the game that we're playing.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Yes. But yeah, it's like you can track the gear that you've acquired on your phone and then the stats of the different characters. And you're trying to help this village survive in a very apocalyptic, kind of mysterious world. It's got decision making, it's got role mechanics. It's some good stuff. It's pretty expensive and pretty multifaceted. Like, to get all of the packs and everything is pretty pricey, but it's a good game.
Mm-hmm. Well, complexity can add a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
More decisions.
Yeah, and it makes it more rewarding when you do things well. How about yourself? You been doing good?
No, can't complain. Just been a little more busy than usual lately. I'm not used to having a fixed schedule.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a while.
Oh, you started a fixed schedule now?
No, but I've just had a confluence of things pop up all at the same time, so I've been kind of having to do things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've actually got jury duty in the morning.
Ah.
Yeah, that's not gonna be fun.
I haven't been called to do that yet.
No?
No. Have you before?
Several times.
Several times?
Oh yeah, but most of them I was in college, so I was exempt. But then the last time was 2020, I think.
Mm-hmm.
During the pandemic, actually. So that was the first time I'd actually had to go and do it.
Mm-hmm.
I had thought I would be good for several years, but apparently not.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I have to go back. So it goes.
Yeah. Chad is saying to be sure to call the night before in case they cancel tomorrow because they got lucky and didn't end up having to go in. Yeah, you can be called for both federal and local elections, I think.
I don't think that they would cancel, though, because the way they do it in Dallas is they'll just get a whole... Well, I guess maybe it's like that everywhere. They just get a whole bunch of people, and then they'll just distribute them amongst multiple different cases.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's the way they did it the last time I was there. So I would imagine they would have to cancel, like, all of the cases in order to cancel it for any given juror.
How do they deal with, like, compensating you for missing work and stuff like that?
What is it? They actually do pay you if you get selected.
Oh, how much? Ballpark.
It's like $4 an hour or something.
$50 a day, lol. Yeah. So it's not a lot of money.
No, it's not much. I think I think there's a rule that says you can't be fired for missing work while you're on jury duty. So I think there is at least that.
Mm-hmm.
But no, it is going to cost you. Yeah, a lot of people don't like jury duty explicitly for that reason. It's just seen as an inconvenience.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually an important part of how a representative political system functions. So people shouldn't poo-poo it quite so much. But yeah, it could be managed better, probably.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess you could get any manner of case from the most tedious and boring to the most saucy and grotesque. And you don't really know going into that. if it's going to be like
No.
a civil case or a criminal case or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, it's very much random in terms of how you get assigned, at least as I understand it. So
Mm.
hopefully something that does not require me.
Mm. How many days do you have to help out with it? Does it depend on the case?
Um, I mean, just for the jury selection, it's just a 1 day thing. But if you do get selected, it can vary from days, weeks, maybe even longer if things get dragged out. There's no specific cap as far as how long it can take.
Mm.
Yeah, it can be quite the involved process.
Hmm.
Yeah, hopefully I don't get one of those. Fingers crossed.
Yep. Hope you get an easy one. They just list out what's going on. And you say, "Yep, guilty as fuck," and then you can go home.
Well, more likely, one or the other lawyer won't like my background and will just kind of rule me out in the selection stage.
What would they not like about your background?
Uh, my profile probably doesn't really match what they're looking for.
Hmm.
Like, if you're a lawyer, you kind of want people well, I mean, if you're a defense lawyer, for example, you kind of want somebody who you think is going to be sympathetic to your client, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're a prosecutor, you kind of want the opposite. So you prefer people who meet certain demographic ticks, it's the people who have a certain profile that you think will be that you think will be optimal for your case.
Mm-hmm.
And grad school dropouts don't really match any of those. we're we're sort of a weird small breed.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think anybody's going to look at my background and think, "Oh yeah, that's definitely exactly the kind of person I want serving on the jury." I imagine there's going to be people they'll find much more attractive.
I don't know. They could find you pretty attractive.
Well, there's no accounting for taste.
Well, jokes aside, I hope it's not too difficult and you have a good time. Maybe see something interesting.
Looking for it's not all that bad. I mean, really, it's just going to be me reading for several hours.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not, so great advice. The only issue I really take with it is that I have to get up at like 6:30 in the morning.
What the hell?
Yeah, I have to be there by 7:15 a.m.
7:15?
Yeah, yeah. So it's going to be an early start, much more so than what I'm used to. So that's the only downside, really. I'm going to have to go to bed like right after we're done.
Jeez. Well,
Yeah, if not for that, I really wouldn't have any issues with it at all.
Yeah, I'm not a morning person at all. And I have
Say
to
la vie.
file a criminal case against them for waking people up that early. Jeez.
Yeah, I get to see the sunrise.
Yeah. Sunrises are nice. It's true. I just don't normally want to be operating at those times.
I concur. Is there anything else exciting been going on the past couple of weeks?
I've been playing that board game thing. We won't do Agent Smith next week because we have the Superb Owl, where owls from around the nation gather together, take photo shoots, and decide who's the most superb out of all the owls. People have chips and dip. There's also that foosball game.
Sounds fancy. I've never heard of that.
Wait, dude. Is he dead man joking, or do you actually not know what I'm joking about?
Superb Owl?
Yeah.
No, I've never heard of it. What is that?
It's a joke name for the Super Bowl because it has the same letters. There's even a subreddit, Superb Owl, which is just a bunch of owl pics.
Gotcha.
Yep.
You got me.
Gotta
I
watch
forgot
out.
it was next week.
Yep. Yeah, it's Chiefs versus Eagles, which I think is exciting because They're both normally bad teams. I'm not trying to throw shade. There are probably angry people in the chat at me now. But yeah, I think the Eagles historically struggle. And then the Chiefs, I don't really know too much about them, but I think they went to a Super Bowl fairly recently. So
Yeah, I
they've been,
thought so too.
yeah, they've been strong recently.
Did
Neither
they win
teams
it?
are Owls, though. That's true.
Ah, Cincinnati. Oh, okay. They made it in 2020, but they lost. But then they won in 2019. Okay.
Yeah, so
They've
they're,
actually been a couple times recently.
yeah.
Well, exciting times for Kansas City.
Yeah.
Something besides fountains to be proud of. They've got the most fountains per capita of any city in the nation.
Wow. Whoever was planning that city decided that's what it needed.
Yeah, I don't think Kansas City is really known for much. Like, I don't even really know what the main economic activity there is.
In Kansas City?
Yeah. Yeah, like what's the economic driver in Kansas City? I have to look that up.
Chat saying that they were featured in the episode of Last of Us last night. I don't know if that's an economic driver.
Oh yeah, they made that a TV show.
Yeah. I heard it's good. I haven't seen it. I didn't play the game either. But people have been all up in arms about it, saying it's amazing. That's cool.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. I heard good things about the game too, but I haven't played that either.
JW says their economic drivers are barbecue and jazz.
That's right. That's right. They're known for barbecue. I forgot about that.
Yeah.
Did you know they actually had a pro hockey team at one point?
What were they called?
The Kansas City Scouts.
Oh.
They didn't last very long. I think they ended up moving to Denver. And they became the Colorado Rockies for a few years.
Oh.
But they didn't have much better luck there. So they actually ended up relocating again. And this time they relocated to New Jersey. And they became the New Jersey Devils, which is what they still are today.
That team I am familiar with.
Yeah, they've been around a while. Won a couple cups. They were very good in the 90s and aughts. They even beat my own Dallas Stars in the 2000 Cup final, much to my chagrin.
Dallas Stars.
Oh, you remember that, eh? Yeah, they're doing better this year, from what I've heard. I don't follow them nearly as closely.
So
Well,
the main news item that people were curious about before we started was that we nuked a balloon, a spy balloon.
I knew it was going to be the balloon.
He knew it. He knows the internet. What is the thing that everyone's been chomping at the bit to hear about from Agent Smith? The balloon.
Yeah, that was a pretty weird story. It kind of came out of left field. I mean, really, it doesn't matter. I don't know why the media fixated it on it so much. It wasn't like it wasn't as though it hadn't happened before. It hadn't really been widely reported. I would grant them that much, but still, it's not really that big a deal. It's just a balloon. They're not that hard to shoot down. It is a violation of American airspace, and that's not all that uncommon.
What kind of
You know, the
balloon
Rush
was it?
It was just a big ass surveillance balloon. Like literally, it was just a giant balloon the size of a couple city buses that had some surveillance equipment attached to it. From the pictures I saw, it really just looked like a satellite with a balloon on top.
Hmm.
Like it was really kind of goofy, honestly, because it's well known that China has spy satellites, so they don't really need spy balloons,
Hmm.
and yet they're using them. And I've kind of been at pains to find a good explanation as to just what the advantage of a spy balloon is over a spy satellite. And I haven't really found a satisfactory answer yet. The only halfway convincing explanation I've read thus far is that they were trying to send a signal that this is a thing we can do and that we're not afraid of you.
We will send our balloons at you. We are not afraid.
Yeah, yeah, we're going to unleash the spy balloons, I guess.
Yep. And if we shoot down one spy balloon, then they will send two spy balloons to take its place.
Well, I mean, there is a cost advantage. They are pretty cheap. It's much cheaper to use a balloon than it is to fire a satellite up into space. So
What did
there is
we
something
shoot
to
the
be said for
balloon
that.
with?
I think it was a missile.
We shot it with a missile?
Yeah, as far as that, from what I was reading on Twitter, I think that was mentioned.
That's very American.
Well, got the job done,
Yeah.
quick and easy. But yeah, beyond that, there's no like escalatory risk. The Russians buzz American airspace pretty frequently. So it's not that unusual to kind of just escort opposing aircraft out of a U.S. airspace.
Hmm.
Uh, Spy balloons are a little unusual in that sense. You can't really escort them out. You pretty much have to just shoot them down, but that's pretty easy to do. Again, it's just a balloon, not that threatening in the grand scheme of things.
Where
I
was
don't
it
even.
in our territory?
Well, it was launched from China into, I think, a jet stream, and they did it in such a way that it floated over Alaska, northwestern Canada, and then into Montana.
Hmm.
And then from there, it floated southeast into South Carolina, where it was shot down.
Hmm.
So the suspicion is, the speculation, I should say, is that they were trying to spy on some of the American nuclear facilities in Montana, because the U.S. has its nuclear silos sort of in the Great Plains region, the Montana, the Dakotas, Iowa, etc.
Hmm.
But that's not an entirely satisfactory answer, because again, satellites can do that.
Hmm.
So why a spy balloon? I did read one interesting theory that balloons are a little more useful because they can fly under cloud cover to a degree, so they're not as affected by weather. Also, they can linger for much longer, whereas satellites can only be used during the period when they're orbiting over a given area.
Hmm.
So there are some advantages, but again, I don't see just what the advantages are. Well, I don't see how the advantages are so much greater than satellites to warrant their usage.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think it's more of a signal thing. That's the best explanation, I think. I would point out too that it's probable that the US, upon detecting balloons like this, can probably jam them such that they can't send back much information. So that's also worth pointing out. They only really would work in any case if you can send them undetected.
Hmm.
Although there was recent information released in the past couple of days that incidents like this have happened before. Apparently, it happened 3 times during the Trump administration, and it happened before in the Biden administration, once in 2021. And in those previous cases, the balloons were actually not detected until later. Apparently, American intelligence agencies did some kind of forensic analysis. That was the term used by the presenter. Some variety of forensic analysis, and they inferred that the balloons had passed through American territory, but they were not actually caught in transit. So this may be the first Chinese spy balloon we've actually managed to catch, as it's been violating American airspace.
How did we not catch them before? Aren't they like slower than shit?
Very slow, but that also makes them a little hard to detect. If you're using a radar, you're looking for aircraft mostly, and they tend to fly pretty fast. So you wouldn't necessarily notice something that was very slow moving, even if it had a decent sized radar signature. Yeah, there's quite a bit of noise in the air as far as radar returns. So you do have to somewhat economize your attention by filtering out a lot of it. So it may just be that the balloons were filtered out. Yeah, balloons are not really the thing NORAD is most concerned about.
What is NORAD?
Wait, what? North American something something air. Basically, it's the institution that was designed to keep an eye on American airspace, as well as as well as airspaces in other parts of the world. It's responsible for early warning, for example, detecting ballistic missile launches. In the event of World War III, it would be NORAD that would detect the missile launches as they happened and would organize the counterattack, such as it were. Actually, you've got me curious. What does NORAD stand for? North American Aerospace Defense Command. There you go. Yeah, I think Canada participates in that. I don't think it's exclusively American, but maybe I'm wrong. But yeah, they're responsible for for tracking, enemy aircraft and whatnot in American airspace, and also for surveilling, I should say, airspaces in opposing countries, rival countries, if you like. Uh, they didn't, their importance kind of diminished after the Cold War ended. They haven't really been quite the same since. During the Cold War, it was very important to have some kind of early warning mechanism to detect any potential attempt at a nuclear first strike by the Soviets. So NORAD was designed in order to do that, to ensure that there was detection, early warning, and then by extension, time to respond, thereby deterring any potential first strike. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, the budget got cut and their responsibilities were pretty significantly curtailed. I don't think they don't even use Cheyenne Mountain anymore. Have you heard of that?
No, what's Cheyenne Mountain?
So Cheyenne Mountain was originally their headquarters, and it was basically a giant bunker. They literally carved it out of a mountain, I think in Wyoming, and that was called Cheyenne Mountain. And that was their headquarters for several decades until the end of the Cold War when they were finally moved out. They did that as a cost-saving measure. It cost a fair bit of money to operate what in effect is a large mountain-sized bunker. So I think they relocated to an air base, like somewhere in the Dakotas or something. I don't quite recall exactly. Yeah, NORAD also is the institution that does the Santa phone call thing every year. It's like every year NORAD reports that they've detected Santa at Christmas time and that he's incoming on Christmas Eve. That was actually kind of a accident. That was a tradition that was started by accident back in the 50s. Yeah, I think somebody, what was it? It was like a kid accidentally called NORAD or something. And so they kind of indulged to the child. And so that kind of became a running gag that's been ongoing for almost half a century now. But yeah, NORAD would technically be responsible for detecting these spy balloons.
Do you think China is going to send spy balloons to look at Santa's base?
I don't know. It depends on how much they want to troll them. If they want to troll Santa, then I guess they would, since that's what they're apparently doing with us. Yeah, it's very weird timing too, because there was supposed to be a trip by the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, to go to Beijing and hold talks about all of the things. There's quite a bit for the United States and China to discuss right now. Ukraine, trade, espionage, just all of the stuff going on in the world basically would have been covered. but they had to cancel the trip because of this whole stupid balloon thing. It would have been a distraction, and it would have made the Biden administration look bad to try to have these talks to improve relations while American airspace was getting violated. So they've had to delay the trip as a result.
Hmm.
So I'm not quite sure what the Chinese government was hoping to accomplish here. Maybe they wanted to look tough ahead of the trip. I think there was a couple other potential explanations. There was an announcement of a base, well, not a basing deal, but basically a military cooperation deal, if you like, between the Philippines and the US recently. So it could have been a response to that as well. But it's anybody's guess what they were thinking. In general, the trend had been towards improving relations. They're not in great shape, but the Chinese government had been sending little signals here and there that they were actually interested in improving relations. There was their foreign minister had been a guy named Zhao Lijian, and he had been known during his tenure for so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. He was very hard-nosed. He went after countries that he perceived to have insulted China, and he was particularly hard on the United States. So he was reassigned a couple months ago to a kind of a more of an obscure position in the foreign ministry. And somebody slightly more moderate has been brought in since then. Criticism of the US has been dialed down in recent months. They've been pretty tame on assistance to Russia since the war started. That's kind of an ongoing trend, but they've kept it up. And they've also announced that they're going to allow movies from Marvel Studios to play in China for the first time in 4 years.
Mm.
That
Why
had
did
been a
they not
ban.
like them?
Um, it was kind of part and parcel of a general decline in trade relations during the Trump administration.
Hmm.
So that ban had been ongoing for several years, but in the past couple months, that ban has been relaxed. So that's again was kind of a signal from Beijing that they were interested in improving relations. They were also going easier on Australia. Australia and China had a pretty sharp tit for tat trade deterioration in trade relations starting late in the Trump administration. But recently, Xi Jinping, during the G20 meeting in Bali, went out of his way to meet Australia's prime minister. And it was actually the first one-on-one encounter between the prime minister of China, between the prime minister of Australia, rather, and Xi Jinping since 2016.
Hmm.
And China also announced that they're going to end their ban on imports of Australian coal, which had been a ban that had been in place for 2 years, going back to that initial deterioration in relations. And as for Europe, they've been much more proactive in engaging with European leadership. He went out of his way to host, what was it, Chancellor Olaf Scholz, leader over in Germany. And Emmanuel Macron is going to visit early this year as well. So just in general, lots of little signals here that China's really looking for engagement. So that made it all the more surprising then when this balloon thing happened. Like that kind of countervails the general positive vibe in China's foreign policy recently.
It's
So maybe
also
some,
kind of obvious too compared to just satellite surveillance. Like, how can you even tell if you're being under someone's satellite surveillance compared to a balloon?
yeah, that's what I thought at first too, but then it came out that they'd been getting away with it for a couple of years. So I guess it is somewhat subtle, apparently.
They're going for that strategy that's so silly that no one would ever suspect it.
Yeah, that also was one of my initial inferences. My first thought was, but that's dumb. Why would you do that? It's yeah, like when I was looking for explanations, the general consensus amongst analysts was that it did not make sense, and they did not understand why China was doing that. So some unexplained weirdness out of Beijing. Yeah, since it came to light that they'd been getting away with it for several years, it makes a little more sense, since if you get away with it one time, why not keep doing it?
Yeah.
But then that still begs the question of why bother in the first place? Again, you're not doing anything with a balloon that you can't do with a satellite. So unless you're just sending signals, which again I think is the best explanation, there's not really any other reason that I can think of to do it.
We'll have to keep an eye on those Sloverlord scouts. There have been some StarCraft memes about the balloon thing. They were like, here's a picture of the balloon, and it's an overlord or an overseer or something.
You
I mean, I'm spying on my opponent right now with the balloon, so I can't judge.
Well, the danger is past now, so
Okay.
America can finally rest easy, knowing that the balloon is safely in the ocean. Did you see that people were shooting at it?
No. Chat was saying that an F-22 shot it down.
No, I mean like regular civilians were shooting at it with small arms fire.
No, but that's funny. How did that work out for them?
I don't think they got it. It was a high altitude balloon, so well beyond the range of small arms, but there were enough people doing it that the government asked them to stop. Not really helping that much. Kind of reminds me of when people were shooting at the hurricane a couple years ago. The government had to step in and ask them to stop doing that too.
Please stop shooting at the hurricane. It's going to spin the bullets around and it's going to hit some poor soul.
Yeah, America at its finest. But yeah, there's not much to that balloon story. I've read some people, worrying about the threat of escalation, and the threat is nothing. There's no real threat of escalation here. The Chinese government came out and complained about the United States government shooting down the balloon. The Chinese government was saying that it was a weather balloon that was blown off course. And
That's pretty far off course.
Yeah. And they were urging the US government not to, quote unquote, overreact. So, of course, then we shoot it down with, aircraft. And the Chinese government then complained that the U.S. response was disproportionate and that the U.S. response was in contravention of international law, which is not true. But that led some people to wonder whether or not Beijing might retaliate. But no, it's just posturing. They're just doing that for a domestic political audience. They're trying to look tough in front of the public in China. But really, if you're going to fly an aircraft, even if it's just a balloon, through another country's airspace without permission, then yeah, it's going to get shot down. That's not a surprise. So there's nothing unexpected in terms of the outcome, and China knows that, and so there's no possibility really of any real escalation here. So that's just hyperventilating in the media for the most part.
Well, definitely a silly news item, which those are always fun.
Yeah, some balloon drama.
Yeah. So what if we got a bunch of ducks to fight the balloons? Because I have heard of eagles taking out some drones and stuff.
I don't think they could fly high enough.
The ducks?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, because the balloon was flying above air traffic, which is why the government didn't act sooner.
What if we gave them performance-enhancing drugs?
I don't think even then. They would have to be bionic ducks.
All right. Then we'll send in the bionic ducks.
Yeah, there was actually another balloon detected in Latin America. I think it was detected flying over Colombia. No idea why. Again, it's as inexplicable as the balloon over the United States. Probably more so, because I don't know what China would want to spy on in Colombia.
Colombians?
But it's happening. Well, yeah. I guess there's something to be said for that. They are very attractive people. So I'm sure it won't be the last time there's going to be Chinese balloons over the United States,
Hmm.
although they may aver next time, given the severity of the response in this particular incident, but we'll see. Yeah, for me, it's especially weird because I'm kind of used to hearing about Russian aircraft buzzing American airspace. That's what I think of when I think of another country violating American airspace. But balloons, that's a new one. That's so weird.
Hmm.
That's such a weird move. Like, I don't have aircraft that can buzz your airspace, but I do have these balloons. It's just a weird trolly move. Like there's just no other explanation for it. Well, other than the doom balloons, was there any other item that you kind of wanted to get to?
Um, I don't think I had something that specifically jumped out at me too much. Chat, let me know if there's something else that you wanted to discuss this week. Did you see anything, Sid?
Oh yeah, I've got quite the list here.
Sweet.
Yeah, well, the United States has been very proactive, along
Mm-hmm.
with its allies, with regard to competition with China in the past couple weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been a good deal of traction there. To kind of move through the list here, Japan and the United Kingdom signed a defense pact, which I think is a bit of a reach, but they signed an agreement, I think, would be a better characterization that would allow the militaries of each country to participate in training and or disaster relief on the territory of the other country.
Mm-hmm.
So that's relatively mild, but it does illustrate that there is an interest in the two countries towards improving military cooperation, which had not been that extensive beforehand. And Japan in particular has been making efforts to try to improve its military. They doubled their defense spending recently. They announced that they would double their defense spending recently. And in general, they've been relatively hawkish in terms of trying to expand the reach of their military industry, the diplomatic connections that they have vis-a-vis China. So this is just another step in that trend, basically, another manifestation of that desire to be more outwardly engaged with other countries as far as cooperation against Chinese influence and the Chinese military.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a positive step for them. There was also a new agreement called the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies. This was an agreement signed between, well, maybe not signed. I don't think it was like a treaty, but more of a handshake agreement made between the United States and India. And so the cooperation involved is going to be regarding materials for defense, telecommunications, and computing, especially semiconductors, apparently. So part of this is to try to wean India off of imported technology from China and to try to make them more autonomous. Also, it's an effort to try to wean India off of Russia a little bit, since India is one of Russia's top buyers as far as defense equipment and other related technologies. So if the United States can inculcate more self-sufficiency in a greater variety of technologies, especially those relevant to India's military, that would cut into Russia's revenue, which of course is an objective for Washington, given the shenanigans in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
There's also kind of a common concern between India and the United States regarding surveillance technology, which China is producing more of. I think Hikvision is one of their top surveillance companies, so they're quite prolific.
Hick
So,
Vision?
yeah, Hikvision. It's like a HIK vision.
Like Country Bumpkin.
No, not quite that type of hick.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they're a very large Chinese company that specializes in surveillance technology, and they're actually one of China's leading investors and developers of artificial intelligence technology. Things like facial recognition technology.
Mm-hmm.
Those kinds of technologies are what they specialize in. So, given the emphasis of trade tensions and strategic tensions between the U.S. and China, on technologies like artificial intelligence, supercomputing, semiconductors, etc. No surprise that this would be an area the United States would want to cooperate with India on. So helping India become more self-sufficient and curtailing Chinese technological influence over India's market. That's sort of the impetus here for this cooperation. So that was a positive move. There was some money given to, well, promised to Nepal. Victoria Nuland, of all people, was in Nepal, and she announced that the US would be investing more than $1 billion into Nepal over the next 5 years, into things specifically like clean energy, electrification, and small businesses. So the US is kind of hoping here to crowd out Chinese investment to a degree. And from what I was reading, they're particularly interested in investing into areas that the Chinese Belt and Road Project has not paid much attention to. So I think Belt and Road has been more about infrastructure than anything, but the US is hoping here to kind of invest into green tech, which they hope will be a more substantive contribution to Nepal's economy and ideally contravene some of China's influence there. Uh, I would point out here that the United States is not necessarily interested in Nepal per se. Obviously, that's not really a country the US has a lot of history with. This, I think, is really more a manifestation of a desire of the United States to cooperate more with India. India obviously cares a great deal about Nepal. They share a common border. And India and China have kind of been jousting with each other over the past 10 years for greater influence in Nepal. Historically, it's definitely been well within India's sphere of influence, to the point where India actually was responsible for managing Nepal's foreign affairs for several decades after India became independent. But after the revolution overthrew the monarchy, what was it, like 15, 20 years ago or so, the Nepalese government became much more interested in charting an independent foreign policy. So they were no longer dependent on India to manage that. They became much more interested in, say, China and trying to kind of play China, India off of each other in order to garnish more investment and more interest. And they've been pretty successful, obviously. So India is at something of a disadvantage vis-a-vis China because India doesn't have as large an economy and they don't have as many resources to work with as far as wielding influence. They actually have a great deal of soft power in Nepal, which somewhat offsets the lack of money they have to invest in Nepal's economy. But the United States is kind of filling that gap there in terms of money
What soft
by
power do they have?
there's a lot of there's a lot of cultural affinity between Nepal and India. They're both actually Hindu countries by and large. There's also significant economic ties. You know, there's very little economic infrastructure linking Nepal with China. In general, the whole Tibetan plateau is very underinvested as far as infrastructure goes. And so economic ties are much stronger as well. So stronger economic ties, stronger cultural ties have given India a lot more influence than they might have otherwise. You know, the difference though is in investment. India does not invest a lot of money into Nepal, whereas China, with its Belt and Road Initiative, has been able to invest billions of dollars into Nepal. They've actually been going out of their way to try to develop infrastructure that could connect Nepal to China physically. I think they've already got some roads open, and they've been trying to develop a rail line that would connect Nepal to China proper. So obviously, that would significantly curtail Indian influence, since presumably China, being the larger market, would probably end up being possibly surpassing India as the Nepal's leading trade partner. But even then, the cultural affinity would still be there. Although, to be fair, China does have some soft power as well. The largest political party in Nepal is actually Maoist in nature. And the rebels that overthrew the monarchy were actually Maoist rebels, again, 15 to 20 years ago. Yeah, there had been a long running civil war in Nepal that had lasted some decades. And Maoist rebels were actually the main combatants, other than the government, obviously.
What would you say makes them Maoist?
Uh, well, They do, for one. They're self-described Maoists.
Okay. I guess
They're
I'm
not.
just generally describing what makes a Maoist. Because I know
Oh, okay,
they're
I see.
following
Yeah,
his teachings, but what exactly does that mean in terms of objectives for them?
right, right. Okay. Well, the monarchy was fairly authoritarian, so there was a desire to get rid of that. So that obviously is very much in keeping with communist ideology. But they were also very much against caste discrimination. Again, that's in keeping with the egalitarianism of the egalitarian ideals of communism. Uh, the Maoist aspect of it, beyond just being communist, was that they were focused on mobilizing rural peasants. That's always been kind of more of a Maoist thing. The Bolsheviks kind of did it too, but the core of the Bolshevik support was always urban factory workers. To the point where the Bolsheviks actually did not think communism would succeed in China because they did not think the economy was developed enough in the early mid 20th century for the factory workers of China to be politically powerful enough to overthrow the government and seize power. Mao had a very different perception of communism that focused a lot more on appealing to peasants, which did not rely very much on communist ideology per se. He was a lot more interested in appealing to them by basically being a populist. Things like land reform, punishing bad landlords. It's kind of a rough phrasing, but basically, some landlords were very predatory, if not outright violent, towards the people that they rented out land to. And these people were very unpopular, but there wasn't a lot they could do because those landlords were also very politically powerful. Also, oftentimes, they actually paid thugs to intimidate people to ensure they didn't rise up against them. So the Maoists went out of their way to target them in order to kind of build credibility and popularity. And they also provided public services in rural areas that the government was not providing, including things like education, which rural peasants did not receive very much of at that time. So they were able to build up considerable popularity in that way, and by doing so, were able to build up a political and economic base of support that allowed them to fight the government effectively, eventually resulting in the government's overthrow at the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949. So that's really the crux of Maoism, rural peasant mobilization, above and beyond just sort of baseline communist ideology like you would expect anywhere. So Nepal is also a fairly undeveloped country, and communism would not theoretically take root there, but Maoism, focused as it is on the rural population, actually made a lot more sense. And so that was the ideology communists in Nepal embraced. And their strategy very much mirrored Mao Zedong's strategy in China. Again, mobilizing the rural folk out in the countryside.
How come there was a big famine in the Chinese Revolution? If it's like focused on peasant
You mean the
farmers?
Great Leap Forward?
Yes.
That was very much a technical thing. Uh, I mean, there's kind of a short explanation and a long explanation. The short version is that it was dumb. It was just badly planned. The idea of the Great Leap Forward was to significantly advance Chinese industrialization. Uh, Basically, they just wanted to really jumpstart industrial. Well, maybe not jumpstart. They did have some industry beforehand, but they really wanted to make a quantum leap in industrialization by significantly expanding the production of steel, which was necessary in order to produce other machine goods, machinery, tools, vehicles like aircraft or ships, just modern stuff in general generally required steel at that time anyway. And so significantly boosting steel production was therefore seen as prerequisite to creating a modern economy. And so China was several years away from being able to do that. Being able to produce a lot of steel requires a lot of investment because steel production requires very large foundries, very large supply chains. It just requires a lot of equipment that's very expensive. So it's not something you could get very quickly without spending a shit ton of money on it. And China, of course, had basically been cut off from, Western markets, which had traditionally been the markets out of which equipment like that had been exported. They were receiving some equipment from the Soviet Union, but it wasn't enough to like really significantly advance industrialization like they wanted to in the Great Leap Forward. So the master plan was to, instead of having capital intensive steel production using modern equipment, they would have labor intensive steel production. Because, of course, China had a big surplus of labor. You know, they did then as they do now. So they thought that they could try to produce steel with labor intensive methods such that they could play to their strength and ideally produce enough steel to kind of, again, jumpstart industrialization. The trouble is that that was never realistic. Like maybe if they had planned it way better and done a much better job educating rural peasants how to make steel, then maybe it could have worked. But even then, it would have been a stretch, you know. But the reality was that they basically just mandated steel production, and they gave sort of broad instructions to party cadres at the lower levels on how to do that. But it wasn't nearly specific enough, and they didn't spend nearly enough time preparing. And the result is that the party at a local level ended up forcing farmers to take time away from farming in order to try to produce steel. And it was just garbage. Like it just could not be done. So there were two problems. One, the quality of steel was very poor, such that they garnished no real benefit to the increase in steel production that resulted. But the bigger problem is that labor-intensive production of steel is very time-intensive. You know, that's the advantage of capital-intensive production, right? You save a lot of time. The equipment does most of the work because it's automated and mechanized. But if people are going to do it, it's going to be very time-intensive. But because farmers had to spend all of that time away from the farms, agricultural production suffered. And the result was big cuts in food production. Now, that's basically the short version of the story. There's actually a longer version that gets more into the politics. So, China's economic growth after the revolution was actually pretty good. You know, from 1949 to 1956, roughly, China's economy grew at a pretty good rate. You know, it was actually fairly impressive. Some of that was just catch-up growth. You know, the economy was basically a disaster after the warlord period. All of the revolutions, you know, the World War II especially was destructive, and then the destruction in the Chinese Civil War. So, you know, all of that stuff was very disruptive to the economy. So even just something as basic as not having huge armies running around murdering people, that alone was a big economic boost. You know, that was a significant expansionary factor there. But even beyond that, they actually did a pretty good job planning things. You know, they were pretty modest in their ambitions at first, and they just focused on trying to expand production, doing land reform, you know, investing in new production, stuff like that. And so by 1956, it looked like the economy, having, you know, outstripped expectations, maybe was set for a big, well, I mean, as the name implies, a great leap forward. Basically, planners got ambitious because the economy overperformed, because it outstripped expectations. So that was one of the reasons that the Great Leap Forward was so ambitious. But there was another factor too, which was more specifically political in nature, which was that Mao Zedong was losing popularity. And that actually had to do with the Hundred Flowers campaign, as well as internal party struggles, well, internal party tension, I should say, with a leading bureaucrat, maybe I should say leading administrator. I think his name was Liu Shaoqi. You know, somebody in chat can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what his name was. But this guy, Liu Shaoqi, was like a major leader within the Communist Party. But unlike Mao, he was not really like a political or ideological leader. He was just more the guy that got things done. You know, he was an administrator at heart, and he was the guy that actually implemented plans and programs and whatnot. And, you know, during a revolution, guys like that are useful, but it's more useful to have somebody who's charismatic, like, say, Mao Zedong. But after the revolution, you need to focus on governance. And as we've discussed many times, governance is much, much harder than revolution in many ways. And during, you know, if you are going to govern well, you need good administrators. And so Liu Shaoqi was starting to outshine Mao Zedong a little bit. And Mao didn't really like that. And Mao, being an ideologue, also did not like the party's general shift away from revolutionary rhetoric and ideals towards bureaucratization, which was a trend that he'd already noted in the Soviet Union that he believed was undermining the Soviet Union. So that dynamic was playing out as well. He was losing support, and also he was losing support because of the Hundred Flowers campaign. That was a campaign in which the party opened itself to criticism. You know, communist governments are not really known for tolerating dissent, but the Communist Party of China, I think in 1955 or 54, kind of in that area, announced that they were going to kind of go easy on dissenters and allow criticism because they wanted the party to receive feedback so that it could improve. And the result was a lot of criticism. They came in for quite a bit, more criticism than they were anticipating, to the point where they were a little concerned about the party's legitimacy. Now, Mao Zedong was associated with the Hundred Flowers campaign, and so he kind of took the blame for that to a degree. Not only for the substantive criticism they were receiving, but also just for opening the party up to criticism in the first place. So between the rise of Liu Shaoqi and the Hundred Flowers campaign, Mao Zedong's brand within the party was hurting a little bit. So he kind of felt like he had to do something dramatic in order to win back political capital. And so that ended up manifesting as the Great Leap Forward. And it was interesting because I've actually read that Mao Zedong himself admitted that he was not very good at economic management, like the actual economy and the business of managing the economy was not really his thing. Like, again, he himself recognized that he was more of an organizer and a fighter, not so much an administrator or an economist. Mm. And so that actually was why he had originally kind of strayed away from that and left that more to the administrators in the party, like Liu Shaoqi. Let me check that guy's name. Father. Oh, Zhou Enlai. Yeah, that was another guy. But I think Liu Shaoqi is correct. But Zhou Enlai definitely was another major administrator in the party now that was threatening Mao Zedong. So anyway, that was sort of the political backdrop, and that was why that happened. But that still doesn't necessarily explain, well, it partly does explain why it was so disastrous. You know, again, Mao Zedong, not an administrator, so when he delved into economics, specifically economic planning, by proposing the Great Leap Forward, no surprise that he wasn't very good at it. It just wasn't his background. Mm. But the party also could not say no either, because he was, even after his decline in influence, he was still like paramount leader, right? He's Mao Zedong. He's the guy that led the party through the revolution. So when he was still able to push the plan through, as badly designed as it was. And so that's kind of how it ended up coming to pass and why it wasn't as effectual as it might have been if it had been designed by somebody else in the party.
So basically, they tried to tech rush too fast by throwing their farmers at steel production, which caused them to fail on both fronts.
Yeah, that's a good summary. But there's also one more variable that needs to be mentioned, and this actually has to do with statistics, which I know isn't very exciting. But basically, well, in general, we can kind of zoom out a little bit and say here that authoritarian political systems, if not communist systems in particular, because they're particularly focused on managing the economy, are not very good at transmitting information, because they're autocratic and because there is such severe punishment for failure. What happens in practice is that low-level officials will often lie about their performance. For example, if you're going to measure a local official based off of economic performance, you're going to incentivize them to lie about that performance. That's true really in any system, even in like a free market system, right? People in corporations have incentive to misrepresent their production. If they have like a quota or something, like a sales quota, they have an incentive to lie about that. But those people in, say, a sales department don't have power of life and death over the people that, they're responsible for. In an authoritarian political system, lower level officials do. And so they have much more ability to lie about statistics than others. Also, in general, authoritarian political systems tend to be fairly corrupt. There's the fact that there's so much discretionary power held by the party as well as by individual party officials means that there's a lot of scope for corruption, for self-interested economic behavior. So between corruption and the incentives facing low-level officials, there's generally misrepresentation of production. That's fairly common. The trouble with the Great Leap Forward is that it ratcheted up the pressure, because the plan was so ambitious and because it was such a priority for the party. There was a very, very strong incentive to meet all quotas. So that meant that, well, two things. It meant two critical things here. One, it meant that there was a lot of emphasis by local officials on meeting the steel production quotas that were imposed. And so that meant that even if local farmers and whatnot had no idea how to make steel, local officials basically forced them to make it anyway. Some of the more well-educated or more competent local officials maybe could have reached those steel quotas without sacrificing as much agricultural production, but as was, that wasn't, most of them just didn't know how to do that. But again, it was a lot easier just to be corrupt and lie than it was to kind of learn how to do it right. Mm-hmm. So that ended up being a problem. But also, besides lying about steel production, they also lied about agricultural production. And this is actually the real answer to your question about why there was a famine. There was a famine because local officials lied about agricultural production, and the government at the national level had no idea until like a couple of years later after the fact. Uh-oh. If you were a national level official and you were just going by the statistics you were receiving from lower level officials, steel production was way up, manufacturing was way up, and agricultural production was meeting quotas. So from your perspective, there were no problems. Mm-hmm. But it was all bullshit. What was happening is that all of the regional leaders and local leaders had failed to meet all of their quotas. They were effectively sacrificing food production to try to meet steel production. And again, that steel production was just, worthless. So in effect, they weren't even actually meeting that. But because of the way the system was set up, there was just no honest reporting. And so the government just had no idea that millions of people were starving until years later. And by then, it was kind of too late, really, to save them. They did reverse course once they figured it out. But it took a while, for that to happen. Because even after it became apparent that there was a problem, it's kind of hard to ignore starving people once they reach a certain critical mass. Even then, there was an incentive at the national level to downplay the disaster. They didn't want to admit that things had gone quite so badly. So it took even longer after that for the government to kind of come to terms with it and actually admit that there was a problem. Also, this was a disaster for Mao Zedong politically, because again, the whole impetus here for him personally was to try to restore his leadership and political capital within the party. And obviously, mass starvation is not helping in that regard.
No.
So he would have been most likely very resistant to admitting that there was a problem, which itself would have been a barrier.
Yep. Lying about steel production and farming is a lot easier than like actually juggling both of those and learning how to do new stuff.
I would add as a side note that I actually heard in a podcast a couple months ago that was talking about statistics in China. It's a weird topic, but they mentioned that communist ideology in China at that time actually saw statistics as it was practiced in the West at the time. Basically forecasting, regression analysis, etc. They saw that as bourgeois, and they actually refused to use it, which itself added to the problem of the Great Leap Forward, because it made it impossible for them to kind of use statistical methodology to infer production and forecast what should have been obvious, that being a shortfall in production. But they weren't doing that. They were just going off of reports of local officials. Yeah, so kind of a meandering answer there to the question, but yeah, the Great Leap Forward was a complex event. It didn't happen for any one reason, but it happened because of largely Mao Zedong's own ambition. And the famine that resulted was the result of bad planning, um, bad institutional design just from an authoritarian political system, uh, bad incentives for local officials, and then just bad statistics,
Hmm.
so to speak.
Yeah, so the problem couldn't really be addressed because it wasn't reported until it was
Yeah,
too late.
yeah. Yeah, that's the benefit of a free market economy. The information is inherent in the prices.
Hmm.
So long as you have a free market, then the prices more or less accurately reflect the demand of the public and the supply by producers. And so you can kind of see what's going on in the economy just by
Hmm.
looking at changes in prices.
Hmm.
Also, we actually can do regression analysis, so we're much better at kind of drawing inferences and forecasting correspondingly than what the Chinese were doing back in the 1950s. How did we get on to the Great Leap Forward?
We were talking about Nepal and China, and you said that some of the Nepalese were
That's
Maoist.
what it was.
And I was like,
That's
Maoist?
what
How and why? And then we're kind of like, what defines a Maoist? Who is Mao Zedong? What did he do? And then whenever people list off like mass murderers, they usually reference him as being responsible for the famine. It sounds like there were a lot of people responsible for the famine, but it was like during his period.
yeah. Yeah, the Cultural Revolution was, I mean, millions of people starved in the Great Leap Forward, so I can't necessarily say the Cultural Revolution was worse. But within China, Mao Zedong is generally blamed a lot more for that than he is for the Great Leap Forward.
Mm-hmm.
The Great Leap Forward was basically Mao Zedong being dumb.
Mm-hmm.
It was just, that was kind of an accident. That was a mistake. But the Cultural Revolution was something he very much did on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And he very much stood by that, even right up until he died. So the public is much less forgiving of the Cultural Revolution than they are of the Great Leap Forward, even though the Great Leap Forward involved possibly more suffering,
Mm-hmm.
at least explicit suffering in terms of starvation.
A nice breakdown. I didn't know most of that.
But yeah, Maoists are very much out and about in Nepal,
Mm-hmm.
and they're very much a political force. Yeah, they actually had they had an election, obviously, after the monarchy fell. And in that election, in the first election, the Maoists easily won the largest share of the vote.
Mm-hmm.
But they actually did not take power because even though they had the largest share of the vote, all of the other political parties were sufficiently afraid of them that they actually created a giant coalition. And it really was like a giant coalition. It was like 24 plus parties all got together to form a majority government that would be able to take power and prevent the Maoists from forming a government. I don't think it ended up lasting, which will not shock anybody who is familiar with the history of coalition governments and parliamentary systems. Anything more than a couple parties is almost destined to fail in
Mm-hmm.
relatively short order. 24 parties is just unrealistic. That's just fanciful. That was never going to last. But they did manage to prevent the Maoist from taking power completely. What happened is that there was a split within the Maoist camp. And so then their vote was split between multiple parties. And so that resulted in a coalition government that did involve Maoists, but also involved other parties. And so the Maoists were not able to kind of just govern as they would. They weren't able to get their way on everything that they would have if they'd taken power at the start.
Mm-hmm.
But politics in Nepal ever since has very much centered around internal political dynamics within the Maoist camp.
Mm-hmm.
For example, over the past some years, the drama has centered around political competition between two of the major leaders of the Maoists. One of them is more pro-China and the other one is more pro-India.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the news coverage around Nepal is centered around their maneuvering around each other and who's getting into power and who screwed over who and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the pro-India guy is in power right now, last I checked. I could be mistaken.
It makes sense that that would be the two poles of influence for them is who is your primary trade partner and also who is your country next to you that you share a lot of cultural overlap with, which means you see the world in a similar way and want to build a similar kind of society. Some people in chat were talking about the geography of Nepal and how it's a nice place to build a base. It is defensible, but it also means that moving stuff around in your territory is really annoying. Has Nepal been
Yeah,
invaded? Like, someone tried to attack and take their stuff? Take
I
their
think
lands?
Britain did at one point, way
Oh.
back in the 19th century. It did not go particularly well. I think overall they were able to defeat the kingdom, but they were not able to subjugate Nepal like they did other regions of India.
Mm-hmm.
And so the result is that Britain actually allowed Nepal to retain its independence. Yeah, they're pretty tough fighters. Have you ever heard of the Gurkhas?
It sounds familiar. What did the Gurkhas do?
So the Gurkhas were Nepalese fighters who fought with the British Army. They were volunteer. I think they were volunteers. And they were renowned for their ability, for their fighting prowess. They were well known as being excellent soldiers. And they ended up fighting in a number of Britain's imperial wars where they kind of added to their reputation. They were just always very effective wherever they went, to the point where a lot of people were actually afraid of them. Their reputation was kind of as sort of these wild men from South Asia
Hmm.
who would come and just kill you with a knife in battle. Yeah, Britain actually continued to accept volunteers from the Gurkhas right up to the present day. I think they're still doing it. So there are actually still Gurkhas serving in the British military.
Hmm.
I don't know that they still have purely Gurkha units like they used to, though. Yeah, I think the Gurkhas were like a specific tribe or caste in Nepal that were sort of a warrior caste,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't quite remember the details. But yeah, there were British, employed Gurkhas fighting in World War One, World War Two, fighting in some of Britain's bush wars during the Cold War, fighting in the War on Terror, even
Hmm.
in Afghanistan and Iraq. Yeah, they're quite well known in Britain.
Yeah, chat's saying that apparently they're trained from really early on to just be very brutal and vicious in how they do their stuff.
Yeah, the British very much encouraged that in their reputation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that makes your uh, branch of your military more threatening to others, so they're scared of you.
Yeah, a little more deterrent value, a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of intimidation. It's kind
Mm-hmm.
of handy. The Germans complained about it, especially in World War One. They complained that Britain was, sending savages against them and that it wasn't very couth.
Mm.
Yeah, the Germans had some fanciful notions of honor and warfare in World War One.
Mm-hmm.
France and Britain were not quite so enthralled with some of those notions, so did not quite adhere to them
Mm-hmm.
to nearly the same degree. Yeah, Britain and France were quite happy to leverage their empires for as much advantage as they could get.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept. I think that was one that came up during the American Revolution as well, where the British had more of a sentiment of getting in your lines and doing your warfare and stuff. I don't know how much that's been hyped up through media and that sort of thing, but they usually depict the United States as having more like guerrilla tactics and doing more hit and run things like that, rather than just doing the military convention of lining up and then agreeing to shoot each other. Which, to me, if I'm being sent on a military mission, that seems pretty dumb to me, especially if you're in the front.
Yeah, well, it made sense at the time, given European warfare.
Mm.
If you're going to send a big army against another big army, those were the optimal tactics. The trouble was they did not adjust them to the different situation in North America, which at
Mm-hmm.
that time was basically a wild frontier, for Europeans. So, sending a big army over into a wild frontier in which you don't have any big army to fight necessitates different tactics. But the British were not all that adaptable in the grand scheme of things. They did make some efforts, but not so much with their army, more so with proxy armies and whatnot.
Hold on, we have a Gurkha joke. There's a joke where the British needed to conduct a secret raid. They asked the Gurkhas if they would be willing to be deployed from a plane. They showed serious reluctance, and after deliberation, the Gurkhas agreed to jump under a few conditions. First, the plane must fly low. Second, it must slow down as slow as possible. Third, there must be bushes or water below them. When Britain informed them they would have parachutes, the Gurkhas rescinded their requirements and agreed. Bit of a anti-joke deadpan, but that's a good one.
Nice. Yeah, they're quite famous. Well, I would add here about Nepal that the public in Nepal in general is a little more skeptical about India. They do have cultural affinity there, and they are a little wary of China, given, the ties with the Maoists and whatnot in Nepal. But at the same time, India is kind of seen as lording it over Nepal, lording its power over Nepal. Because again, India was actually managing Nepal's foreign affairs for a long time. And the perception in Nepal is that India was largely self-interested in how it did that. And they also see India as interfering in the nation's politics. They see India as siding with anti-Maoist political parties and also supporting certain caste groups that don't get along with the government or the Maoists. So for those reasons, there's a little bit of anger and mistrust towards India. They see India as feeling entitled to interfere in Nepalese affairs to a much, much greater degree than anybody in Nepal would like.
Mm-hmm.
But that said, that doesn't mean that they fully embrace China either. In general, the public's desire is to have Nepal's sovereignty respected, and that other countries, specifically China and India, should deal with India on an equal footing, and that they want to deal with both India and China. They don't want to exclude anybody. They don't. It's not like they want to push India out completely, but they just want to be able to deal with both powers without the other kind of screwing with them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of the ideal amongst the public. I don't know that it's all that realistic an ideal. I don't think they'll ever get that, especially given the stakes. India is very, very aggressive about about ensuring that China stays on the other side of the Himalayan mountain chain.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just Nepal that they're very active in that regard, too. There's a couple of border wars that India has fought with China. And the main objective of those border wars from the perspective of India was ensuring that China did not get any kind of foothold on the other side of the Himalayas. So conflict over in Arunachal Pradesh and I think Kashmir were the two main ones. But they've also been supporting Bhutan in a territorial dispute with China. It's not technically India's border that's in dispute there with China, but the Bhutanese are not really in a position to contest their border dispute with China, and so India has been helping them out by sending Indian troops to enforce Bhutan's claim.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also Sikkim. This is another example of how aggressively India patrols the Himalayas. Sikkim today, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing the name, but Sikkim today is a state of India. And if you look at a map, you can see that it's in the Himalayas. It's a Himalayan state. But you can also see that it's jammed between Nepal and Bhutan. And it may not surprise you then, seeing the geography, that it was not actually originally a part of India. It was actually originally an independent Hindu kingdom. Actually, it was Buddhist, wasn't it? It was originally a Buddhist kingdom in the Himalayas. That was not part of India. And what happened is that during the period in the 1960s when tensions between China and India were at their height, India basically mandated, basically issued a, what's the word I want? Uh, well, they just declared that Sikkim was going to become part of India. And they did that because there's actually a pass through the Himalayas in Sikkim. There's not a whole lot of passes through the Himalayas, but Sikkim has one of them. And the Indian government was sufficiently worried that the Chinese government might somehow seize power, through proxies in Sikkim or otherwise conquer Sikkim, or just basically gain access to that pass, that they decided that Sikkim needed to be part of India. And the result then was that Sikkim was summarily annexed by India in the late 1960s, which was a pretty bold move. I don't believe the Sikkim government really acceded to that. That was not done voluntarily on their part. But New Delhi did not care. From their perspective, the nation's security was at stake, if not also Sikkim's security, or at least such was the logic, that from their perspective, the conquest and annexation was justified.
So they have some history there.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, long story short, there's a lot of history of India just aggressively enforcing its territorial claims along the Himalayas. So that's very much the gist of India's foreign policy in the region.
What is Nepal's economy based off of?
Two things: agriculture and tourism. And that's about it. It's still not a very developed economy. Maybe they've got a couple other things going on, but for the most part, yeah, that's about it. So it's pretty poor, which makes it easy for the Maoists to kind of mobilize people. Between poverty and caste discrimination, there's a lot of discontent in Nepal's rural areas, so that makes for ready fodder for entrepreneuring communists to come in and take advantage of it. Well, to kind of bring this full circle, because Nepal is very poor and undeveloped, one of the main ways that China, India, and the United States are trying to exert influence is economically, by way of investments. And so the United States is working with India here, albeit indirectly in this case, by promising to invest $1 billion in Nepal's economy. Yeah. Again, Washington does not really care that much about Nepal, but it does care about India. So by trying to counteract some Chinese influence in Nepal, they're indirectly helping India fulfill its foreign policy imperative of minimizing Chinese influence in Nepal. So in that sense, it's a form of cooperation against China specifically. So let's see. We were talking about, yeah, that was the point I was originally making. So the United States and its allies have been making a lot of moves over the past couple weeks as far as competition with China. It's one of the more active periods I've seen. So I mentioned Japan and the UK and their agreement. America came to an agreement with India, the initial critical and emerging technologies agreement, or sorry, the initiative on critical and emerging technologies. And then there was the announcement of this money being invested in Nepal. So there's been a couple other moves as well. In the Pacific, there was a couple new items. Kiribati announced that they would rejoin the Pacific Islands Forum. That's worth mentioning because the Pacific Islands Forum is very much a venue for Australian influence in the region. And a lot of island nations in the region are not very happy with the way it's been managed over time. There weren't really a lot of alternatives, but since China has been more ambitious in terms of its diplomacy in the region, there was a sense that there was an opportunity to kind of play the West off of China. And so Kiribati took the opportunity to leave the Pacific Islands Forum to kind of illustrate their discontent and their desire to make changes. So there's been some diplomacy since then, and they've now announced that they're going to come back. So that is a diplomatic victory, albeit a minor one, for the West. Fiji announced that they would end a police training exchange with China. Obviously, that's a win for the West. That mitigates Chinese influence a little bit. I imagine that was done after some kind of agreement with either the United States or Australia on some kind of countervailing agreement. Some other area that they were negotiating on. And let's see. So that's Oceania. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Oceania.
Oceania. There you go. And then in the Philippines, I think I kind of touched on this a little bit before, but the Philippines and the United States came to an agreement on access to bases in the Philippines. So the United States is not going to be able to build bases in the Philippines or get back any of its old bases that it had turned over to the Philippines a couple decades ago. But the United States will be able to rotate troops through Filipino bases in the Philippines. That's an agreement that had been negotiated for several years, but that had been in negotiations for several years. It kind of got delayed a little bit by the election of Duterte to the presidency in the Philippines. He was kind of more interested in appealing to China for money and favors and whatnot. That did not end up going anywhere, or at least it didn't go as far as he wanted to. And so by the end of Duterte's administration, he had started shifting back towards the United States in terms of his alignment. And then Marcos Jr. was elected president because Duterte could not run for another term. So in the subsequent election, Marcos Jr., the son of previous dictator of the Philippines, Marcos, became president, and he's been surprisingly pro-American in terms of his foreign policy. Maybe not all that surprising, given that his father was a pro-American dictator during the Cold War and was probably receiving money from the CIA. But nonetheless, I have read that foreign policy experts were expecting him to be a little more non-aligned, to be more interested in playing China off of the United States. As is, he's been pretty explicit about being very much on the American side as far as Sino-American competition goes. So that's resulted in the renewal of the negotiations over this access deal. And now they've actually finalized it. So the United States will be able to have a significantly larger military presence in the Philippines than they had before. Before it was basically some advisors, effectively, but not much else. But now they'll be able to station several thousand U.S. troops in the Philippines on a fairly regular basis. They also won the right to construct new facilities on Filipino bases. So the bases will remain under the control of the Philippines government, but there will be some new facilities that can be constructed that will enhance capabilities on the bases and give them some new infrastructure that will presumably give them some new, well, again, capabilities. And I would assume that those would be under the control of the U.S. So still not the same as, formally building bases. Some people will say it's tantamount to that, but I would point out that the size of U.S. military bases when the U.S. still had a real presence there was very, very large. Some of the largest American military bases in the world were in the Philippines during the Cold War, specifically Subic Bay and Clark Air Force Base. So we're not getting anywhere near those levels, even after this agreement, but it is a significant uptick from what we were doing before. So it's definitely worth mentioning in that regard. I would point out that having small deployments rotating through different countries in the region is actually a big part of American strategy in the region. In general, the fact that China has long-ranged weaponry, cruise missiles and other forms of over-the-horizon weapons, has necessitated the United States decentralizing its forces in the region. Because if you have all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak, if you have all of your military forces in just a few locations, it's going to be fairly easy for China to bombard those locations and do a lot of damage. So the trend over the past 10 years has been towards diffusing American power in East Asia, if not in the Indo-Pacific generally, into a broader range of bases, not only American bases, but also the bases of local allies that give America the right to rotate forces through. So the rotations are temporary in nature, temporary in nature. But the way they're designed, we basically always have forces rotating through. And given the number of rotational agreements that we have with different allies in the region, we effectively have a much larger presence in the region than we had before, but just on a smaller scale in individual cases. Small deployments throughout the region rather than having American power concentrated in a few bases like Subic Bay, what have you, Yokohama, etc. So the agreement with the Philippines is very much in that vein. It's not surprising that the U.S. would kind of do this. And so in that sense, it actually is a pretty big win for U.S. strategy, since it gives us a much stronger forward presence than we had before. The Philippines was kind of a missing link. We had forces in Japan and South Korea, obviously. We had some in Thailand. But the Philippines was kind of a vacuum, that we really needed to fill. Presumably, if something had happened, like a Chinese invasion of Taiwan or something that happened in the South China Sea, for example, I would expect the Philippines government probably would have allowed the U.S. military very quick access in order to help them out. But now, that's a lot different than having U.S. forces on the ground ready to go. Invariably, reaction time will be much less in the case something happens. And it also significantly enhances the ability of the U.S. To respond to incidents in the region that do not involve the Philippines at all. For example, Taiwan. So it'll be a big help to have those forces ready to assist Taiwan in the event that something happens. Obviously, we already had the base in Okinawa, but presumably, in the event the United States got involved with the prospect of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, Okinawa would probably get some attention from the Chinese military. So being able to diffuse forces close to Taiwan, away from Okinawa into the Philippines, is actually very helpful for that reason.
Where is Okinawa?
It's in the Ryukyu Island chain, southwest of Japan. It basically is just right between Taiwan and Japan. It's actually, Okinawa is actually,
That's the lower island, or the big
yeah.
one.
Yeah, it's actually surprisingly close to Shanghai. You don't always see that in the maps, since when you see Okinawa in the maps, they're generally focused on southern Japan. But if you zoom out a little bit, you can see it's actually close to Shanghai, relatively speaking. No doubt uncomfortably so for Beijing.
Mm-hmm. And there's a U.S. base there? Or they're just
Yeah,
allied with us?
see, at Okinawa,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a huge U.S. base there.
A huge ass U.S. base. Nice.
Yeah, it's actually a series of bases. Maybe I shouldn't say huge. It's a series of bases that collectively comprise what is effectively a very large U.S. presence in Okinawa. Yeah, there's like an air base. I think it's mainly Air Force and Marines that are there. And I think the Navy is more in Yokohama.
I wonder if that's where my family member was stationed, because he was stationed in Japan for a long time as part of the Navy, but I don't remember exactly where he was. Could have been this place.
Probably Yokohama if he was Navy. It's the more likely candidate, but it could be.
And where in the Philippines were you saying they were going to set up stuff?
There's not like any one specific location. It's just broad access to multiple bases in the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
Again, these are pre-existing bases that are controlled by the Philippines government. So they're not constructing new bases or anything like that. This is just access to pre-existing bases.
Mm-hmm.
I think most of them specifically that were mentioned were in the island of Luzon, which is the big island in the northernmost part of the Philippines. Which is no surprise, given that that's the part of the Philippines that's the closest to Taiwan.
Yeah, that's the island with Manila.
Yeah. I think one of them is also going to be a base in the Palawan Island, which is a big island southwest of the Philippines. So basically, the parts of the Philippines that are the closest to the South China Sea and Taiwan are the parts that this agreement is going to be the most relevant to. The bases in those territories will be the ones that the United States will be rotating troops through.
Yeah, if you're looking at the region in general, if the U.S. has a presence in, like, if we have an ally in Australia and then we have bases in Philippines and Taiwan and Japan, then that's kind of like a just barrier toward
Oh
the
yeah,
rest of them.
yeah, exactly. That's what China would call their first island chain.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a second and third beyond that that they have aspirations to expand their influence to. But right now, they're still hung up on the first island chain,
Mm-hmm.
which suits Washington just fine. But yeah, this agreement definitely puts the Philippines more firmly in the American camp. I
Mm-hmm.
would point out that the Filipino government under Marcos has said that they don't want to alienate China. They do want to maintain good relations, specifically economic relations. You know, the Philippines and China do a fair amount of trade.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't doubt that the Filipino government is looking to maintain that.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of security and in terms of strategic alignment, it very much seems that the Marcos government is aligning with the United States. So that's a very positive development from the perspective of Washington and in terms of the broader competition, such as it is between the United States and China. Yeah, I was surprised you mentioned Okinawa. The United States, obviously, there was a huge battle for Okinawa at the end of World War II, but the United States, after that, maintained the bases it set up there all throughout the Cold War. And actually, the United States technically had sovereignty over Okinawa for 25 some years after World War II. You know, in other words, it was not technically under Japanese control.
Mm-hmm.
And the same was true of Iwo Jima, actually. There was another famous battle the United States fought in Iwo Jima in World War II, and so we actually kept that island as well. But we gave up, I think, both of them. When I say gave up, I mean we returned the islands to Japanese control in the 1970s, whereupon they returned to Japanese sovereignty. But we still kept the bases. You know, technically, it was as technically we did have a basing agreement with Japan after that, but we did retain them, much to the chagrin of some of the locals. A lot of the locals complain about all of the noise from the air bases and whatnot, and there's sometimes some negative incidents. You know, every 10 years or so, there's a high-profile rape case involving a U.S. serviceman.
Mm-hmm.
That's not doing the U.S. any favors either. But beyond that, yeah, the United States has gone out of its way to maintain those bases against a lot of pressure from locals. And the Japanese government in general actually wants the bases there. You know, they prefer to have an American presence in that region. They just can't always admit it because it's kind of politically unpopular in a lot of
Yeah,
quarters.
and mainly that would just be as a chip they have against China if they would need to use that.
Yeah, yeah, because the Japanese have their own island disputes with China.
Yeah, they would probably prefer to have their own military. We've talked about this some before, as they agreed to a bunch of rules of they can't have uh, another big scale military, so they don't get like imperialist again, kind of a
Yeah,
thing. So they just have really advanced drilling equipment now.
yeah, yeah. They've been very crafty about circumventing some of those restrictions. And the gloves are kind of coming off in that regard. You know, when the Japanese government announced that they were going to double their defense budget over, what was it, like 5 years, you know, they weren't kidding. That was a much more credible commitment than anything Germany has been doing
Mm-hmm.
over the past year or two. So they are going to build up their military pretty significantly. It's not entirely clear exactly where they're going to put all the money, but it is definitely a significant signal that they're serious.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Japan's military is actually an important part of America's strategy vis-a-vis China. Because right now, America has so many commitments around the world that it's difficult for it to be strong in any one region.
Mm-hmm.
So Japan, by having a strong military, is actually the anchor of America's military presence in the region. You know, the American forces there are an excellent deterrent, since China knows if it messes with them, it's going to bring in a lot more military forces from the United States. But as far as the disposition of forces already present right now in the Far East, the Japanese military presence is much larger than the American military presence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they just don't have nearly as much capabilities as far as projecting force. In that sense, the United States actually has the advantage, even given the smaller forces it has in the region.
Is
But yeah,
that
we're
because we
definitely
have
still in okay.
aircraft
Yep.
carriers and stuff?
Yeah, aircraft carriers, ranged weaponry. Like the Japanese have been very wary about acquiring long-range weaponry that could be used for offensive purposes.
Hmm.
So technically, they do not have cruise missiles and other long-range missiles of that sort. Although they actually do, I recently found out.
Have they considered spy balloons?
No, no, they don't. Japanese technology is pretty good overall. So they're actually quite capable of engaging in their own intelligence gathering. There's
Without the
actually a
use of
lot of,
balloons.
without the use of balloons, correct. Yeah, there's actually a lot of cooperation between Japan, South Korea, and the United States as far as intelligence gathering. So they're pretty good on that count.
How strong is South Korea's military?
The Army is pretty strong. The Air Force and Navy, not so much, for obvious reasons.
It's very expensive to make those things.
Yeah, yeah, it's expensive to be strong in all three, so they focus on the Army on
Hmm.
account of their neighbor.
Yeah.
Their neighbor is a little bit belligerent, famously so. So the Army gets the lion's share of resources among the branches of the South Korean military.
Hmm.
Yeah, they've been investing a lot in expanding their capabilities, modernizing, investing in better leadership and training and whatnot. So they're a lot better than they used to be. The South Korean Army actually used to have a very negative reputation uh, amongst its allies, specifically the United States and its military. During the Korean War, there was a lot of problems with Korean units getting just steamrolled by North Korean and Chinese units. So it took a while, but they have kind of restored their reputation. At this point, they're pretty solid from what I've read.
Yeah, they're a country that has mandatory military service as well. So one of the
Yeah.
things that we see as StarCraft people is, oh, this pro gamer is now retiring at least for the next year to do their mandatory military service, which means that all of the adults in the society, I don't know if it's men and women, maybe chat knows, but they're relatively more combat ready.
Just men.
Just men.
Yeah, the mandatory service only applies to men.
Do you think that their reputation in military got better because they started fielding StarCraft pros, or
No, I think it was just the result of, I mean, they did well in Vietnam, for one. For those of you not familiar with this trivia, South Korea actually fought in the Vietnam War, and their contribution was not insignificant. In fact, the unit they sent actually was well regarded as being one of the more successful units in the war. So that helped. Also, just decades of working with the United States to improve training, training officers, for example, as well as, NCOs and whatnot. And then they've also been investing in better equipment over time. At this point, South Korea actually has one of the up and coming military industrial complexes in the world. There's a number of middle income countries that have tried to enter the defense market, but few of them have been particularly successful. Turkey has been successful, but increasingly South Korea has been successful. South Korea actually signed a deal with Poland to sell them a bunch of tanks. And it could well be that they pick up a lot more market share in Europe because there's been a lot of consternation, shall we say, amongst European countries about Germany. Historically, a lot of countries in Europe have bought their tanks from Germany, the famous Leopard tanks. But some of the recent hesitancy by the German government to allow countries to send their tanks to Ukraine has a lot of countries rethinking their defense relationship with Germany. The issue is not the quality of the equipment. The Leopard tank is very good. The issue is more the fact that Germany has a de facto veto over how those tanks are used. And nobody wants their foreign policy to be held hostage by another country, right? So there's a sense now that maybe Germany is not entirely reliable in that specific regard. And so for that reason, some countries are looking at non-traditional vendors as far as their defense needs. And so South Korea could well be a beneficiary, so I've read.
Hmm.
And you might see a lot more South Korean kit in Europe over the next 10, 20 years, among other places. I think the Emiratis are the other big entrant. Yeah, the Turks, the South Koreans, and the Emiratis, I think, are the big up-and-comers in defense. Yeah, Brazil and South Africa actually are also pretty big contributors there. You'd be surprised how big their market share might be. But they've never really been able to expand outside of the niche areas that they've kind of gotten into over the past half century. So they haven't really been able to go anywhere over time. So bigger players than you might think, but they haven't really grown their share much. Oh, yeah, I was going to talk about Japan's cruise missiles. So, you'll appreciate this. This kind of falls within the rubric of Japan's helicopter destroyer slash carrier. So Japan officially has no cruise missiles, but what they do have is an anti-ship missile that they developed and designed themselves. And this anti-ship missile has an abnormally long range for an anti-ship missile. Something like a Harpoon or an Exocet has a range of like maybe 100 miles or 200 miles, maybe more if it's like a modified version. But in general, what you want is a cruise missile that's going to lock onto a target that a given ship will detect itself. And ships have relatively limited range in terms of their search radars and fire control radars. So this anti-ship missile that the Japanese developed has a much longer range than the radar abilities of most ships. So that was the first red flag for me when I was first reading about that. Yeah, the other big red flag was the guidance system. So this anti-ship missile actually has terrain following radar, which is weird.
Hmm.
Anti-ship missiles don't need that.
It's a very, very good anti-ship missile that does lots of other things too.
Yeah, yeah. So terrain following radar in a missile is something that you could use for a missile to compare the terrain that is directly under it with a map of terrain that it has in, say, its memory. And that would allow it to determine that would allow the missile to determine where it is and guide itself to a predetermined target. Now, anti-ship missiles are not used to target predetermined targets, right? Ships are moving targets. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to target a ship, you're going to use radar, most likely. Maybe in the terminal phase, it's got something more fancy, like some infrared or a TV thing, an optical sensor or whatever. But by and large, you're going to target a ship with radar. You would not need any kind of terrain following technology there. You know what missiles do use terrain following radar? Cruise missiles.
Oh.
The Tomahawk cruise missile uses exactly that technology, or at least it used to. I think it's shifted to GPS technology now. But originally it used terrain mapping systems in order to help guide it to its target. And this Japanese quote-unquote anti-ship missile uses that technology. So it has an exceptionally long range and it has terrain mapping capability. Very suspicious. And the Japanese have been modifying it over the past couple decades to extend its range even further. So technically, Japan does not have a cruise missile, but the anti-ship missile that they developed really, really looks like a cruise missile in practice. So you can put this in the same field as the anti-helicopter destroyer. This is an example of Japan's military being sneaky again. Mm-hmm. They've got a capability here that they're not officially supposed to have, but which they have developed in secret. Yeah, they're very smart about that.
Yeah, and it seems like it would be pretty annoying to go after them and definitively prove that it's one thing versus another.
Mm-hmm.
Like, who's going to do that? And then how do you actually definitively say that? And then how do you enforce that? You can't really. So they're just trying to toe that line, I guess, of being able to scale up in a way where they don't get too much shit for it.
Yeah, and they have definitely gotten shit for it. There are pacifists in Japan who are very wary about efforts to remilitarize Japan. Mm-hmm. And they've been fighting the government for decades. on the government's efforts to try to de facto rebuild the Japanese military. They've only met with middling success. In effect, the Japanese government has been able to build up its military over time. But at this point, they're not even really hiding it.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, there's a very clear drive by the Japanese government to build up its military and acquiring long-range fires, cruise missiles effectively. That would basically be an outright admission that they're trying to acquire the ability to project force outside of Japan and Japanese waters.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that they're going to acquire new cruise missiles. Again, they effectively already have one, but maybe they'll just stop lying about it. That might be the real substantive change in that regard. That and acquiring a lot more of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you could do a whole history of the Japanese government and how it's tried to circumvent pacifist measures in its constitution. That is an entire conversation unto itself.
Yeah, chat's kind of pointing to an even broader one of haven't other countries in the past who had treaties that limited their military been sneaky and made stuff and called it different names?
Well, the Weimar Republic is the obvious example.
What is that?
There was a lot of restrictions put on Germany's military as part of the Treaty of Versailles after World War One.
Mm-hmm.
And the Germans basically set about breaking it immediately. Like they didn't even really wait. So they were supposed to keep their officer corps underneath a certain cap. Like they were not allowed to have beyond a certain number of officers in their military. So what they did instead is that they had the Freikorps, for one, which was a paramilitary organization indirectly supported by the government. That was technically allowed. And they also created a bunch of They also created a bunch of bullshit bureaucratic positions in the German military that involved hiring people who were not technically officers. These are just administrators, quote unquote, but in effect, it was a way of keeping on more officers than they were supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they were also supposed to refrain from building ships above a certain tonnage. And that was done as a de facto ban on building battleships because, ship classes were largely associated with tonnage at the time. So the way the Germans got around that is by building what were called pocket battleships. So technically, they were below the tonnage in question, but the armaments were actually the armaments of a battleship.
Mm.
Yeah, this is actually a pretty interesting design.
So
But
tiny
yeah,
boat with huge gun.
effectively, yeah. And they were actually pretty effective in the early stages of World War II. But yeah, I think those are some of the main examples I can think of in the case of Weimar Germany.
These aren't battleships, they're fishing boats. Fishing boats? Why do you have a huge gun on it? What if you have a rival fisherman who's taking your fish? Oh, fair enough.
Yeah, fun fact about the German Navy, they were actually planning on building a large enough navy to contest the North Sea, well, maybe not even the North Sea, but just the waters around Germany with the Royal Navy. So they were actually building battleships and carriers even before the war started. But the war ended up starting before that program was finished. And when the war started, they ended up diverting most, if not all, of the funds from the naval rebuilding program towards the Air Force and Army. And so that program never came to fruition. Yeah, the original plan for the Germans was actually for the war to begin around 1944. But Hitler saw an opportunity with, Poland. And being the consummate gambler he was, he went for it. And he kind of assumed, he didn't know for sure, but he assumed Britain and France would not go to war over Poland. So he thought he would still end up getting the time to rebuild the military.
Mm-hmm.
But his gamble ended up blowing up in his face in 1939. So as a result, World War II ended up starting, quote unquote, early.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually why pretty much everybody and their mother in Europe at the time started the war with somewhat subpar militaries. Like the German army, the French army, and the British army were not actually fully prepared for war in 1939. Just nobody was. It was very much an early start.
Yeah, well, World War One was so nasty that I think most countries would not expect someone to be eager to get back into it.
Yeah, yeah. The interwar years saw a lot of disarmament. The expectation was that nobody would ever want to repeat the horrors of World War One. But that isn't the way history swings.
Yeah.
So they got another one anyway. But it took a long time for people to cotton on to the fact that another one was coming. The West really should have started rearming much sooner than it did, but there was a lot of political resistance. There was a sense that by rearming, they were actually making the war more likely to happen. There was a sense that they were threatening Germany and encouraging basically German aggression. In this case, a kind of defensive aggression. If we rearm, then the Germans will be afraid and then they'll attack us. We don't want that. We don't want to scare them.
Mm. Oh, they've been startled.
Yeah, that was the crux of appeasement. And in retrospect, appeasement was pretty dumb.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to speak with hindsight, given the horrors of World War One and given the economic difficulties of the period, there was just inherently a lot of resistance to spending money on rearmament and just a lot of concern about the possibility of another war. But it just was not realistic. People were very, very unrealistic about the nature of the Nazis in Germany, the way German politics was going, and just how stupidly ambitious the Nazis were. In a way, the Nazi invasion of Europe was almost a corollary for the Russian invasion of Ukraine in the sense that it was just way beyond their capability, given what they had at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people thought war was unlikely specifically because the German economy was not in a position to prosecute a war that could actually succeed in conquering Europe. Like they were not in a position to take on economies much larger than theirs, given how export dependent they were. So some people said, no, war won't happen for that reason. It's just not economically viable for the Germans to do that. It would be suicide. Well, Nazis are dumb. You should have accounted for that. Maybe then you would have seen it coming.
Yeah, it's interesting how when you have a lot of fervor politically or nationally or whatever, that can really motivate you to take risks and make big moves, which can sometimes be a good thing, but sometimes it can cause you to definitely overstep your capabilities.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what happened with Japan and China too during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Like even before Japan invaded China, well, invaded in 1937, they'd actually kind of been doing it even before then. But even before 37, when the Sino-Japanese War really started in earnest, the Japanese government had done a study. They had done research into how much it would cost to invade China. And the Ministry of Finance told the rest of the government, we cannot do this. This is not even remotely viable. We do not have the resources to invade, conquer, and subjugate China. And the army did it anyway.
Oh, yep.
Go figure. So they got slammed. Both Germany and Japan did. And, if you read or listen to any history of World War II, one of the decisive factors in the outcome of the war was the size of the economies in the Allied camp. The US economy, the British economy, to a lesser degree, the Soviet economy. But the sheer amount of resources they could bring to bear was just way beyond what the Axis could bring. The whole war from their perspective was basically a gamble that they could win and that the Allies would quit in the early going, that it would just be too hard to take back all of the territory that they would have lost in the early stages. And it didn't work. And they paid very grievously for that mistake.
There's someone in the chat who's asking if you can expand on the idea that Russia is overextended with the invasion of Ukraine.
Well, I mean, specifically with regard to the state of the Russian army at the onset of the invasion, given subsequent events after the invasion, it was very clear they were not ready. Some of that was just stupid assumptions about the Ukrainians not fighting and whatnot. So, you can give them some credit for that. But even beyond that, it was very clear that the Russian military was not in a good state. After the first month of the war, the Russian army should have been able to adjust fairly rapidly and then show the world what it could really do when it was actually prepared to fight. But they didn't. Or maybe they did and they just weren't very good at it. But regardless, it's clear that all of the efforts to reform the Russian army over the past 10 years, which the Russian government made a big deal out of, like every year they would come out and say, we're modernizing our military. We're so much stronger than all you assholes in the West. You should be afraid of us. And then they just fail miserably in Ukraine over the course of just like a year.
Yeah, I think one of the comparisons that I've heard, I think this was actually a perspective of a family member of mine who thought that the invasion of Ukraine would be similar to the invasion of Iraq by the US, because a lot of the way that Russia talks about their military is they're like the other superpower. There's the US, and everybody knows that they did a lot of stuff in World War II, blah, blah, blah. And then Russia is the other one that is like equally that strong. And if they want to roll into someone, they can. So I think they expected like a pretty quick in and out, just a few days. They could take Kyiv, they could do whatever they wanted to, install their government, and just basically take the country and then call it theirs until the world got tired of telling them, no, you took that by force. But didn't really go that way.
Ew.
They got stuck in the mud, figuratively and literally.
Rasputitsia.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, the initial invasion was just super badly planned. That was like the main problem for the Russians. The crazy thing to me is that they actually kept trying to stick to it. Like even after it was blatantly obvious the Ukrainians were going to fight back and that it was going to be a war, they actually just kept sending units in, telling them that they wouldn't need to fight. Like it was the craziest shit. It took them way longer than it should have to adapt. But even after they adapted, like they have not performed well. They've performed better over time. I don't want to, deny them any credit. They have adjusted to a degree, but overall, the performance has not been good for the Russian army. It has definitely damaged the army's reputation outside of Russia, if not also inside of Russia. So that's what I mean in terms of not being prepared. It's a little bit different in the sense that Germany was, before World War II, was actually making a real earnest effort at rebuilding its military and was fairly successful in doing so. They just ended up taking a gamble that resulted in them going to war before they were fully finished with that renewal. Whereas with Russia, they had supposedly been building up their military over time successfully, and in fact, it was not successful. Like the new equipment that they were supposed to have, they didn't have. The better trained units they were supposed to have were not better trained. Like just nothing that was supposed to be there for the next war was there. Maybe if they had planned it better and been better prepared, it would have gone differently, but it didn't. So in that sense, there is actually a parallel. It's not perfect, I grant, but it is there. That was quite the tangent.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how we got there.
We like our tangents.
We did. We do. We do at that. Philippines, Russia. I can't backtrace all of it.
Yeah,
I was talking.
You compared Germany basically jumping the gun and attacking when they were unprepared, kind of like how Russia did in Ukraine.
Right. Oh, and we got onto that because Germany.
Question,
Yeah. Well, no, there was before that even. There was a comparison. Oh, God, I don't remember. My brain doesn't want to cooperate. Anyway, I was talking about how the United States and its allies have been making a lot of moves against China. I'm slowly working my way through the list here. We've had a couple tangents. And somehow I was talking about the Philippines, and that led to talking about Okinawa, and then Japan, and then South Korea. And then that's what it was. Militaries that are governments that lie about their military. There's supposed to be restrictions on the militaries, and governments build them up anyway in secret. So Japan did that, and then that led to Germany, and then Russia. There we go. That's what the thread was. So Was there anywhere else we wanted to go with that tangent?
I don't think so, unless there was something that jumped out at you for that one. Has there been any major developments in Ukraine? We didn't really do an update this time.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'll, I've definitely got the update ready,
Nice.
but I just wanted to I just wanted to finish this line of items here as far as the moves that the United States has been making, because these are actually important moves, and in general, the United States has not been doing well in its competition with China. Like overall, there's still a lot of drift and aimlessness in U.S. strategy vis-a-vis China. So over the past couple of weeks, seeing Washington actually make some substantive moves and having them be actually useful was kind of a nice change of pace.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. I guess there's just two more items here. So one, semiconductors. The United States introduced a bunch of export restrictions on not only semiconductors, but also AI technology, supercomputers, blah, blah, blah. That was done at the end of 2022. But in order for those export restrictions to really be impactful, the United States needs cooperation from other countries. Specifically, it needs cooperation from the Netherlands and Japan, since those are the two other major exporters of the relevant chips in question. So, if the United States blocks off these exports, but Japan and the Netherlands don't, then that means China is still going to have access to them. They'll just buy from the other two countries instead of the United States. So there had been some consternation in Tokyo and The Hague about whether or not they would actually participate in these export restrictions, because the industry in question is quite lucrative for them, and they don't really want to hamper it. They'd already been participating in restrictions on the exports of the most cutting edge of the relevant technology, but the United States wants an expansion into just advanced variants of the technology generally. And that's where the resistance has come from. But over the past couple of weeks, I've been reading that there actually has been substantive progress in terms of an agreement between the United States, the Netherlands, and Japan about imposing new export restrictions on advanced technologies uh, in the relevant categories. So there has been no final agreement that I'm aware of that has been announced, but there is an agreement in principle. So I've read anyway. So if the United States could make that happen, that would be a big victory there in terms of this containment strategy as far as advanced technologies going to China goes. There's still a lot of room for, there's still a lot of that needs to be done in order to make the strategy airtight. There needs to be broad-based export restrictions. For example, even if Japan, the Netherlands, and the United States all restrict exports of the advanced technologies like this, it's still going to be possible to get to them by way of third-party countries. So, China could set up shell companies in like Singapore or maybe the Cayman Islands or some other country, import the chips or whatever into that country, and then re-export them onto China. So in order for the export restrictions to really be airtight, there's going to have to be probably what's going to be an addendum to an amendment rather, to the Wessinger Agreement. I'm probably mispronouncing that too. I know I'm awful about that, so I apologize. But the Wessinger Agreement, which we talked about, I think at the end of last year, is an agreement that binds together virtually all of the world's countries in a common export control regime. And the export controls in question generally regard things like inputs needed for the construction of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear technology, and a couple other items. I think missile technology is also covered. So the United States is going to push hard in 2023 to try to expand the Wessinger Agreement to encompass the technologies in question, semiconductors, supercomputer tech, AI technology, what have you. So that's going to be for the future. So the export restrictions as they are now are not going to be entirely effective, but getting the Dutch and Japanese on board is definitely a big win. That's going to advance their effectiveness considerably just by itself. So that's worth noting. And then the final note I had here on this subject has to do with reforms of the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps has been debating ferociously a bunch of debates to the composition of the force over the past couple months, probably longer than that. So the force is going to become lighter and it's going to be more distributed. So, for example, they're not going to have any more tanks, which in particular was an item of debate. They are going to have armored vehicles, but they're not going to have actual, tanks, such as they're traditionally thought of. They're also going to downsize the number of helicopter squadrons, and they're going to have fewer infantry. Supposedly, they're going to lose about 2 battalions. So the reason that they're making these changes is so that the Marine Corps can be lighter and better able to deploy quickly in order to deal with contingencies, probably in the Far East. In general, these reforms are viewed in the context of competition with China. Like I was talking about before, the US military wants to be less decentralized so that there's fewer points of failure and fewer obvious targets for the Chinese to go after in the event of a conflict. And the United States Marine Corps in particular has been affected by this because, of course, competition with China is largely taking place. Well, it's a global competition, but it's largely taking place in Southeast Asia and East Asia, and that's largely a maritime domain. So that means that the United States Navy and the United States Marine Corps are going to be disproportionately responsible for waging any kind of conflict against China that might occur in the region. So that being the case, this redistribution strategy is resulting in the United States Marine Corps being redesigned, basically, to be more, well, like I said, lighter, more deployable, etc. It's also worth mentioning that they're designing littoral combat units, I think is what they're called. So this, again, is part of this overall redesign. Littoral combat units are basically going to be naval units, in effect, maritime units that are designed to be able to engage very quickly, for example, in island hopping. So they're going to have a strong maritime element that will allow them to contest the waters around given islands. And they're also going to have an amphibious element. They've also been investing more in these. They seem weird to me. I guess they've been around a while, maybe 10 years or so. But they're basically these sort of pseudo-amphibious assault ships. So if you're not familiar with amphibious assault ships, these are basically mini carriers. But instead of being designed to carry exclusively aircraft, they're designed to carry Marines, specifically infantry, landing craft, and then also some helicopters and also some fighters. I think specifically the F-35. It used to be they were designed to carry Harriers, but since then they've been replaced by F-35. So that's sort of the new Marine Corps fighter, air superiority fighter. But anyway, these are very powerful ships. They have a lot of ability to project power, but they're also very centralized. It's if you sink one, you're going to do a lot of damage. And so given China's increased ability to project force in the region, that's kind of a problem. So what the Marine Corps did is they developed this new ship that is designed to have similar capabilities to an amphibious assault ship, but to be much less expensive and to be much lighter and less of an obvious point of failure. So it's got like a little deck on it, and it has the capability to load landing craft onto it and to carry supplies and whatnot. But it's much more hollow. It's not designed to constantly carry troops like an actual amphibious assault ship. It's just designed to be, in effect, a waypoint. If you have helicopters in an area and they need someplace to land or rearm, you can use one of these ships. If you have landing craft that need just a place to rearm or to withdraw to, for example, or what have you, these ships can fill that purpose. And all of that without having to have an actual amphibious assault ship in theater. So it's a nice stopgap. It's much less of a blow if you lose one of these ships. But at the same time, they offer similar capabilities to the traditional ships that had filled that role. So these are all just examples of reforms, basically, that the Marine Corps is embracing that are designed to adapt the Marine Corps to the maritime space in East Asia. And all of them involve the force becoming more nimble, more deployable, smaller, etc. So that again is, this is something that's been playing out over the past 10 years, but over the past year in particular, the Marine Corps has been implementing more of these reforms. So I thought it was worth adding to the list here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for people outside the U.S., we have the Army, which is like standard ground stuff, the Navy, which is usually water stuff, the Air Force is air stuff, and then the Marine Corps is kind of overlapping with the Army and the Navy. I guess that one is maybe the hardest to describe.
So the Marine Corps is actually a part of the Navy.
Oh.
The Navy does technically control it, but in practice, it's its own separate branch. It's run as a separate branch. It has its own chief on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it fights for its own money in budget battles in Washington like the other services. So effectively, it's its own branch of the military, but technically, it is a subdivision of the U.S. Navy. Yeah, it's kind of similar to the Space Force in that regard. Technically, the Space Force is its own branch, but it is it is technically a subsidiary of the Air Force, I believe. Let me check that. Chat can correct me on that. I should do the usual disclaimer before I forget. It's getting kind of late. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here, more painfully obvious at sometimes than others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me if I'm wrong. I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while I do this, but I will read it later. I do enjoy the feedback I get on here. So in this case, I'm asking for feedback on whether the Space Force is a subsidiary of the Air Force. I think they are, but I could be wrong.
Chat's wondering why the Space Force didn't take care of the balloon sooner.
Well, the Space Force is not designed to engage in any kind of kinetic operations. Space Force is basically all about reconnaissance. So it's about managing space assets for the most part, and the vast majority of those assets are involved in some variety of surveillance or communication or what have you. But they do not actually control any kinetic assets that could destroy a target. That's not in their purview. Technically, if you want to find a service to blame for that, it would be the U.S. Air Force, since they're responsible for managing and securing U.S. airspace. Yeah, the Marine Corps has a long history in the United States that goes all the way back to the founding of the United States. The Marine Corps was not really a major part of the military, though, until I want to say World War One. At that time, they were scaled up a bit and deployed to Europe as part of the war. And after that, they retained a sufficiently large budget to kind of be an ongoing concern. Before that, they'd been pretty minor. Mostly, they've been involved in these little bush wars in Central America, Nicaragua, Haiti, what have you. Then after World War One, they got scaled up, got sent to some more bush wars after that, and then the big one hit in World War II. And that's when they really got big. So after World War II, there was a debate about whether or not the United States really needed a Marine Corps that was quite so huge relative to its original size. It had been significantly upscaled during the war, and it was determined that it was worth keeping them around. For one, the Pacific Theater obviously was a maritime domain, so it made sense to keep naval troops around, which is effectively what the Marine Corps are. And it was also done because division of labor. It's just the Army was kind of better for land operations, and the special role that the Marine Corps had as a force specifically designed to land on beaches and whatnot was determined to be of sufficient relevancy, even after World War II, that it was worth it to keep around a force that was specifically trained in that. There's been debate ever since about whether or not that's actually true. I don't think the Marines have stormed a hostile beach since D-Day in World War II. So I don't know that it's really a relevant part of their mission anymore. But they insist that it is. That's part of their raison d'etre. That's part of their reason for being. And it's been able to kind of preserve them as an independent force ever since World War II as a result. They do still train for it, and they do still have the capability for that. That is to say, the capability to storm a hostile beach. Might seem weird in a modern context, but that is something that they can do. They can do and have planned to do.
Are they also able to storm a friendly beach?
Yes.
Nice.
Yeah, they've done that. But yeah, the Marine Corps has been able to retain itself as a independent branch effectively, mostly since World War II. They got big, I think, for the first time after the First World War, but World War II is when they became like their own ongoing political force in Washington. And they've been able to kind of maintain themselves ever since. There's been, over the past 20 years in particular, more criticism. It's just not entirely clear anymore why a large Marine Corps is necessary.
Mm-hmm.
But they've been able to cite the fact that they are specially trained, to land on hostile beaches. That's part of it. Also, they're much faster. They're much more deployable. That is to say, the fact that they have amphibious assault ships constantly patrolling the seaways and whatnot means that they're often the first land forces that can be deployed in response to a crisis. Mm-hmm. The Army takes a much longer period of time to deploy anywhere. So that is actually useful to have what are in effect naval infantry just constantly ready to go. Mm-hmm. So there is some utility there. And then they've also been able to maintain their budget and their status as an independent branch, partly out of just affinity. The Marine Corps has quite the fan club. There's a lot of people in government who have served in the Marine Corps and are very fond of it, and they kind of fight tooth and nail in bureaucratic battles to defend their de facto independence. So that actually has helped a lot. I know that sounds like kind of a soft power type thing. It's kind of intangible, but that actually does influence budget battles in Washington and by extension, outcomes. If you want another example in the military, look at the A-10. Probably should have been retired a long time ago, but it sticks around because a lot of constituents will actually write their congressman demanding that it be maintained.
That's for people who don't remember, the plane that has an awesome sounding gun. It just shoots super fast. Yeah, it is. A-10 Warthog Brrt is a really high YouTube search.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's got a huge-ass Gatling gun on its nose. It fires cadmium-tipped rounds designed to penetrate armor. And for those of you who don't know, the A-10 was designed to be an anti-tank platform. It's designed to destroy hordes of Soviet tanks washing across the frontier of West Germany.
Yeah, I think we talked about this plane. It was like the plane was built around the gun there.
Oh, it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had to do that. It really is an abnormally large Gatling gun. So the problem with putting a big Gatling gun in an aircraft is that it vibrates. It causes problems for the airframe. So, if you don't design the aircraft around the Gatling gun, then what's going to happen is that you're going to fire it, and then the plane basically just breaks apart, which is not very good for, pilots. They don't like that. Yeah, for those of you who maybe are not familiar with the Soviet equivalent, they actually designed a aircraft. It was actually a modified version, I think, of the MiG-23 or the MiG-27, which is basically the same thing. And they actually tried to attach a huge Gatling gun to it. And it ended up being very, very unstable. I think they did get it to work eventually, but it took a lot of engineering. They really had to rework the plane's infrastructure to make it viable. Yeah, it's a very difficult technical challenge to get that to work. But the United States has some very capable engineers, so they were able to get it functional.
Do other countries have similar competition between their branches of military like we do? Because you were talking about how they're making bids in Washington for we need this much money to make this kind of military thing.
Oh, yeah. Historically, that's been the norm. In a lot of developing countries, branches of the military will actually seize power. So obviously, there's a little competition there. In the case of Chile, it was actually the Air Force. Augusto Pinochet, the general who seized power, was the head of the Air Force when he launched the coup. So that kind of gave the Air Force a special edge in government. But it also kind of limits competition, since when, the head of the rival service is the dictator, there's only so much you can do. Yeah, you probably see more overt competition in democracies, just because the budget battles there are sort of based a little more on, popular opinion. And so that creates some room for some lobbying amongst constituents. You can kind of go to the people and say, hey, we need more planes. We need better tanks. We need a water cooler in the office in the Pentagon, just stuff like that. So that creates a little more room for battles like that to take place. And by extension, it can exacerbate the rivalries. It also kind of manifests if one particular service is like the obvious favorite. That was actually the case in the United States for a long time. For most of US history, well, obviously we didn't have an Air Force for most of US history for obvious reasons. So for the most part, we had the US Army and the US Navy. And again, the Marine Corps wasn't really a big deal until like after World War One. So 1700s, 1800s, and then the early 20th century, it was basically Army versus Navy. And it was very obvious that the government favored the Navy. We've kind of talked before about why that was. The Army was seen by liberal Democrats in the United States as being a threat to democracy, since armies throughout history had overthrown governments and seized power. So keeping the army small was seen as important. But also, the United States was a trading nation. We did a lot of trading overseas. And so it was determined that it was important then for the United States to have at least a relatively powerful Navy. So right from the start of the country, there was a bias against the Army and in favor of the Navy. And that resulted in some consternation in the Army as a result. And that kind of laid the groundwork for the rivalry that would kind of evolve over time and which exists today. Yeah, I don't know how pronounced the rivalries are in Europe these days, but historically they were pretty prominent. The Army in Germany was always paramount, much to the chagrin of the Air Force and Navy. Probably the only reason the Air Force got attention was because their head was, one of the highest ranking members of the Nazi Party, Goring in this case. The Royal Navy traditionally has been the favorite of the British government, much to the consternation of the Army and Air Force. I'm not sure how it works in France. I'm not sufficiently familiar with their politics to know what kind of inter-services rivalries they have there, but I'm sure they have their own history. Really, probably every country in Europe has their own inter-services rivalries, but I'm not as familiar with them. I can't tell you what the inter-services rivalries are like in Liechtenstein.
Mm-hmm.
I have no idea.
I guess the rivalries are kind of a form of healthy competition that incentivizes them to stay competitive and not be complacent. They want to innovate and have a reason why their branch is better, at least in some capacity, than the other ones. So they have their niche and they keep their funding.
Yeah, they definitely do have an incentive to rationalize and justify themselves. And in so much as other services go out of the way to kind of diminish the rival services, yeah, that is important. Yeah, a lot of that has to do with just mission. What are our strategic needs and how does my service best service those needs?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, after World War II, the Air Force actually got a lot of favor, like for the first 10 years or so. Because a lot of people knew that the United States needed to maintain its security commitments overseas, but they also wanted to save money.
Mm-hmm.
They also wanted to draw down the size of the military after the World War II. And so the compromise was that the United States would be disproportionately dependent on nuclear weapons. There were nuclear versions of everything, nuclear artillery, nuclear bombs, nuclear shoulder-launched rockets.
Nuclear birthday cakes.
I don't know about that, but yeah, nuclear weapons were very much in vogue as a cost-saving measure. And the Air Force took advantage of that by arguing, look, with these weapons, which are so powerful, we can just win a war from the air. So we don't even need a navy or an army. You can just give all the money to us and we'll win all the wars for you. No sweat. Just let us nuke all of the things and you'll never need an army or navy again. And for a while, that argument actually carried some weight, and they actually did see a lot of investment in that vein. The Navy was able to counter that being able to launch Well, the Navy kind of went along with it. The Navy's always very smart about these things. They said that, yeah, that's a good point. Bombing targets with nukes is a good idea. We happen to have quite a few aircraft ourselves, in the form of naval aviation, aircraft carriers. So the Navy made the point, you should still fund us because we can maintain we can maintain the power to project nuclear force from the sea. And the aircraft carriers are much less vulnerable than these fixed airfields that the Air Force is using. And in that way, they were able to kind of deflect some of that pressure from the Air Force. The Army didn't really have a counter argument, so they ended up seeing their funding get gutted, at least up until the Korean War, anyway.
Was there much public sentiment, or I guess backing for the Korean War? Because that was before my time. I remember there was a lot of protesting of the Vietnam War.
Oh, okay. So there's two ways I can answer that. In terms of comparing it to Vietnam, no. There was nowhere near as much public opposition to Korea as Vietnam. Vietnam really discredited, if not delegitimized, the US government. So Korea never did anything like that. That said, there was actually more opposition than you might think. In the first year of the war, I think the public broadly supported the government in the war effort. It seemed like obvious Soviet aggression. And maybe people don't remember this, but when the war started, everybody basically just blamed the Soviet Union, even though it was only the North Koreans who were prosecuting the war effort in the start. Everybody just assumed they were acting as proxies for the Soviet Union. So the impression, the broad-based impression in the American body politic was that the Soviet Union was invading South Korea and that it was basically a war of expansion. And in that sense, it was kind of seen as in the same vein as, say, Anschluss, when Germany annexed Austria, or the Sudetenland, when Germany annexed the western part of Czechoslovakia. That was roughly how people were thinking of it. So in the start, people were very supportive. They thought it was the right thing to do to go to war to try to defend South Korea and defeat the communists. As the war dragged out, into the second year, the third year, and whatnot, that's when public support really started to wane. Because there was a sense in the second and third years that the war wasn't really going anywhere. The war at that point really stagnated. The first year saw a lot of movement, right? The North Koreans pushed the South Koreans all the way into the southeast part of the country, into the Pusan pocket. And then the United States joined in with the UN forces, and they were able to push them out and stabilize the front around Pusan. And then, of course, MacArthur launched the famous landings at Incheon, which cut off the North Koreans and forced them into a headlong retreat. And that resulted in a retreat all the way back to the Yalu River. And that, of course, is when the Chinese entered the war, and then they pushed the UN forces all the way back down to the 38th parallel. So that was the first year, and that was very dramatic, obviously. But then after that, negotiations for peace started. And at that point, there wasn't really as much impetus to try to seize territory. Rather, the impetus was more to try to improve the relative positions along the 38th parallel. So there were a lot of fights for hills and other defended positions between one side or the other that were meant more to gain negotiating leverage than they were to actually win the war. The trouble was, attacking defended hills is very expensive. It takes a lot of, it's very expensive in terms of human life, obviously. And what the public saw then is a stagnant war that was just feeding people into a meat grinder. Like, there didn't seem to be any real progress in the peace negotiations, which lasted like 2 years or so. They were very much prolonged. In the meantime, people keep dying. And like I mentioned before, the South Korean army had a very bad reputation in the war. So a lot of the people in the public were very critical of their erstwhile allies. The sentiment was that the United States was fighting in Korea to protect South Koreans, but that the South Koreans were not really willing or able to fight to defend themselves. So that created some bad blood, and that kind of undermined support for the war over time as well. So just in general, by the time the war ended, the public was pretty well sick of it. But in general, they still supported the broad objectives of the war, that being to defeat the communists and deter the Soviets from launching any further forms of aggression. But the public definitely did not have a taste for it. That did not translate into broad-based anti-war sentiment or anti-war protests either.
Hmm.
So nothing comparable with Vietnam. That was a whole political phenomena unto itself.
Gotcha.
Let's see, are we doing okay on time?
Got another 20 minutes or so.
Okay. Well, nominally, we've been talking about China.
Mm-hmm.
That was sort of the route from which we've branched off today. So I guess I'll try to kind of get through some of the other China stuff that I wanted to share.
Sure. Yeah, it all really started with the balloon.
It all started with that damn balloon. So one of the items worth mentioning here is a shift in economic policy. China has this thing called the Central Economic Work Conference, in which they sort of lay out economic planning. And what was notable about this year's conference is that they really homed in on consumption. So we've talked before about how there's sort of a general desire, a long-term objective of the Communist Party of China is to transition China's economy from an economy dependent on exports and investment to an economy that is driven by consumption. That is really part and parcel of transitioning an economy from a developing economy to a developed economy. So this is something they want to do, that they've wanted to do for a long time, but they've been very much at pains to make it happen. For one, there's been institutional resistance. The model that they've been using has been very much focused on investment. And whenever there's a crisis, that's what they go back to. And the result is that this idea of an economy driven by investment and exports just kind of keeps retrenching itself over and over again, in spite of the government's efforts to make the transition to a consumption-driven economy. So that kind of resistance, that kind of defaulting to what works in the past has worked against these efforts to modernize the economy. So now, though, the government is more specifically and explicitly saying, we want to make this a transition, and this transition is a primary priority, which is unlike what it was before. It was something they wanted to do, but it wasn't the main priority. Now they've shifted the focus. So we may well actually see some pretty significant economic reforms in China if they actually do follow through with this. So that could well be something to watch for in 2023. In terms of the tech sector, there's been some changes. Specifically, the government is easing up on the tech sector. Starting in 2021, the government really started cracking down on the tech sector in China. There was a sense that the tech sector was turning into an opposing center of power within the Chinese political economy. And there was also a lot of public upset with things like, privacy and whatnot. So the government thought it could score some populist points by cracking down in that regard. That had a pretty deleterious effect on the health of the tech sector in China. Overall, it still grew pretty well and it was still fairly robust, but they didn't get nearly as much investment. And in general, the sector became relatively more conservative in terms of their outlook, since they weren't sure what the government was going to do to them next. But over the past couple months, the party has announced a number of measures that basically reverse some of the measures that had been implemented before. So that's a very positive change. They talked about this at the conference I mentioned as well. Basically Xi Jinping gave a speech in which he spoke more favorably of the tech sector and said that they were going to try to use them in order to help drive the transition in the economy. So that's a positive sign for the tech sector. That's like the first positive thing the government has said about them. And, it might sound strange to base economic forecasting off of speeches, but in China, the political system is paramount. That is to say, the Communist Party is paramount. So whatever they say invariably has a lot of weight in markets just because of how extensive their reach is in the economy. Now, there's not all good news. Some tech firms have come in for worse treatment than others. So there's a firm called Didi, which is a ride-hailing platform. It's basically China's equivalent to Uber. And the Chinese government actually announced that they're going to release a national ride-sharing app. And this is going to compete directly with Didi. But because it's a state-owned enterprise, it's highly unlikely Didi is going to be able to maintain their market share. Whenever there's a state-owned enterprise operating in the economy, you basically know by default that they're going to win. Like, there's not a lot of point in competing with them. When you have the backing of the state, you lose by default.
Mm-hmm.
So now that the government is getting into this app game, now that they're presenting their own app, DD's prospects are significantly declining. It doesn't look good for them. So it could be that the Chinese government is going to do this with other areas as well. It's just not entirely clear. I'm not even entirely sure why they bothered doing this, introducing a competitor to Didi. My best guess is that Didi had kind of a bad reputation. A lot of temp workers and the kinds of workers who work for these sort of apps, like Airbnb or what have you, delivery apps in particular, they have a bad reputation as far as how they treat their workers. There's a lot of workload and very little pay. So it may be that the party has identified these kinds of jobs as a potential source of unrest and opposition to the party, and that they're trying to improve conditions. Probably in most cases, they're going to improve conditions by improving things like minimum wage and provision of public sector goods of one sort or another. But in this case, they've gone so far as to basically nationalize the industry. They're just going to take charge of the provision of ride-hailing applications. And in that sense, presumably the workers will be better treated, hypothetically. But that's the best explanation I could come up with as far as to why Beijing would want to do this. It's unusually intrusive into the Chinese economy, even for Beijing. They do not normally do this. Or if they do, I haven't heard of it. So it was noteworthy in that sense. So the tech sector in general is going to do better, but there's a couple of sectors within the tech sector that are probably not going to get better because they've been specially identified as problem children by Beijing. Moving on to the property sector, Beijing has also announced that they're going to start going easier on the real estate firms in China. That was something else that they'd really cracked down on in 2021. They basically cut off real estate firms, especially the larger ones, from financing. And if you've been following property market news in China, you know that had a big effect. There's been a pretty significant decline. The decline has not occurred everywhere. There's a lot of cities like Beijing and Shanghai where the declines did not happen. But in a lot of other cities, there have been declines in property prices. And more specifically, or more importantly, rather, real estate firms were absolutely hammered because they had a kind of pseudo Ponzi scheme business model that basically required the continuous supply of financing. And when they were cut off, a lot of them went into default. And it created a lot of problems for the financial system as a whole because there's a lot of shadow banking that goes on in China that has created a lot of hidden links between not only banks and state-owned banks, but also just regular investors who don't have a lot of investment options in China, and so who throw their money into these sort of shadowy financial vehicles that they don't really fully understand, and which are often involved and targeted on the real estate sector. So, been a lot of drama there over the past year, a lot of questions about what the government was going to do about it. The government, for the most part, has been cracking down really hard on malfeasance. In general, it recognized that they could not just allow the property market to collapse. Specifically, they could not just allow real estate firms to collapse, given how complex and interwoven they were into the broader financial sector. So what the government did is it tried to thread the needle. It tried to stabilize the finances of the largest real estate firms while also trying to find the ones that had misbehaved and been the most corrupt and punishing them and their leadership. That in general has been the strategy. They've also been encouraging mergers. I think the effort there is to try to consolidate as many real estate firms as they can, especially the worst performing of them, into a fewer number of large firms that the government could more easily manage and maintain oversight over. So this approach had been pretty effective. It had kind of stopped the bleeding and stabilized the market. But the pressure was just unrelenting. Like in general, the market is still declining, and the real estate firms still have been having trouble raising financing and reaching a point where they could be self-sustaining again, like they were before government intervention. So the government at this point has finally relented, and they've announced that they're going to allow relaxation of restrictions on access to capital. This is kind of part of a trend. This isn't like a binary thing. It's not like they were blocked from capital and now they're unblocking it. They had progressively restricted access to capital over time. And then starting in 2022, they started progressively relaxing restrictions to capital. So this is the latest manifestation of that trend. But it does reveal that the government is still concerned about this and that they don't think they can entirely manage the problem anymore without allowing flows of capital to come back into the sector. Hypothetically, it's possible that they feel that they've sufficiently managed and stabilized the real estate firms enough that they can allow the finance to come in without, creating a moral hazard. If you allow the firms to behave badly and lose money and then just bail them out with more money, then you're just kicking the can down the road. The problem will manifest again, probably worse later. But that's what the government has been trying to avoid up till now. So either the government feels that they've addressed the problem sufficiently, that that's not going to be an issue, and that they've punished all of the firms to the point where they've created deterrence, or they've just given up and they've said, fuck it, we don't want to deal with this anymore. We've got bigger problems, so we're just going to allow real estate firms to get money again and kind of probably restart the same Ponzi scheme bullshit they were doing before. I'm sure the government will try harder to make it more difficult than it was before. But it may be that they just can't. The Chinese economy is too big, the government's ability to oversee it too little to really prevent all malfeasance, especially in a sector that has as much growth as the real estate sector. So I'm inclined to think that they're probably throwing in the towel here. Of the two possibilities, I think that's the more likely. I don't think they're quitting completely. They're going to still manage the sector to a degree until they think they can get it to a self-sustainable footing. But the fact that they've given in on this particular point over time suggests that they don't think they can entirely manage it themselves. I think to a degree they think that it can only really be managed if they allow the sector to continue as it was to some degree, which is not ideal, but there's not a lot of alternatives. Also, labor market. So this is a fun one. There's actually a labor shortage in China. And, for those of you who have been following the labor market in China, that's not necessarily a surprise. Labor markets have been getting tighter over the past 10, 15 years, with the result that wages have been going up. But in particular, they've been tight lately for the past year or so. And that has to do with zero COVID. All of the COVID lockdowns and whatnot shut down a lot of industries. And more to the point, they resulted in a lot of migrant workers being quarantined. And it turns out that migrant workers really, really hate that. For one, the fact that the factories they worked in got locked down was bad enough because it meant that they lost their income. But being quarantined was even worse because not only did they lose their income, but now they're stuck in a house, where they can't, or a house, a barracks, a residence of some kind, whatever, where they just can't leave and go find another job. They're just stuck in place. And that was exacerbated by the fact that they often had expenses that they could not get relief for. You often had to pay for the apartment you were quarantined in, or whatever other facility you were paying rent on at the time. And that's to say nothing of other expenses like food and whatnot. Oftentimes they couldn't get relief for that either. So you can't make money, but you still have to keep paying your bills. Not ideal. So the result then is that migrant workers actually stopped coming to the coast to work in factories because the risk of getting stuck in a lockdown was considered too high. Now, some workers did come, but the rate has fallen over time to the point now where a lot of factories in China are actually getting squeezed really hard by it. Now, this isn't something that's been reported on a whole lot outside of like business news outlets, but this has actually been a significant headwind for China's economy. And this probably was one of the factors that contributed to the government's decision to end its zero COVID policy in December. It was probably reaching a critical stage where they really needed those workers to come back in order to ensure the economy could recover in a healthy way. So the news that I read recently that just kind of underlines this is that two provinces, Guangdong and Fujian, which are some of the main exporting provinces, are actually chartering flights to bring back migrant workers who had been, refraining from coming to the coast to work. That's a pretty good deal if you're a migrant worker, a free flight. Normally it's too expensive for them. Usually migrant workers take the train. China famously has invested a lot in high-speed rail, and a lot of migrant workers are moved great distances over that rail network. But in this case, the governments in question really want to incentivize those laborers to return. So paying for that ticket completely, is obviously going to be cheaper for the migrant workers than taking anything else. You know, a free plane ticket is cheaper than a rail ticket, even if a rail ticket is cheaper than a plane ticket. So that should work to a degree. You can only move so many people by air, though, so I don't think it's really a substitute. But it really shows how desperate they are to try to incentivize the return of the migrant workers. They're really trying to kind of use weird creative policies like this. Generally, just as a side note, whenever any kind of government, local, state, national, whatever, starts engaging in weird tricks like this, in terms of like public policy, like weird niche public policy ideas, that's often a sign that they're under pressure. Maybe it's a sign that they just have a lot of money and they want to experiment with stuff, but more likely they're getting squeezed somehow. Whenever a government is getting squeezed in terms of its budget or there's a lot of pressure to deal with some kind of problem, but there's no obvious solution, they'll often pull out all of the stops and start using all the weird niche policy proposals that were not really seen as viable before. So giving free plane tickets to migrant workers kind of qualifies.
Yeah, I did see a documentary about the bullet train in Japan. There was a bunch of assassins who were on it, and there was some like valuable case. You know what I'm talking about. Okay, that's good for a second.
But that's all I had for China today. I just thought those were all some important developments that have happened. Just in general, the West is actually getting better at responding to Chinese influence in the rest of the world and countering it and containing it. There's been progress there. And in China itself, there's been more of a shift towards loosening things up a bit, going less hard on the tech sector, less pressure on the real estate firms. And obviously, the end of zero COVID also kind of falls in that purview. And also shifting to focus on consumption for the economy. All of that suggests the government is being basically less of a hard ass. Because the trend before had been very much more towards government intervention and oversight over the economy. But these measures suggest some pullback from that. I don't expect them to go like full liberalization, but these are shifts in that direction. So we'll see if these are just temporary measures designed to address specific issues in the Chinese economy at present, or if they mark a broader shift in economic planning. That remains to be seen.
Did you see that movie, Bullet Train?
Not yet.
It's pretty fun. It's got good writing and it has a pretty fast tempo. Definitely not a like cerebral movie that requires you to think about stuff too much. More so like fast and poppy action with good writing. I had a good time. New Top Gun as well, I would say, is worth a watch.
Oh, is this new?
Top Gun Maverick?
Bullet Train.
Yeah, relatively new, like a couple years old, I think.
I think I heard somebody saying that one. Yeah, somebody was praising that.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't call it a masterpiece, but it's definitely a fun movie.
It's a couple recommendations in a row. That's a good sign.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess to kind of wrap things up, since I know we're probably about out of time, did you see the news about the earthquakes?
I did not. Where?
So it's southeastern Turkey along the border with Syria.
Huh.
You really hadn't heard of them? I'm surprised.
No.
7.8.
It's pretty big.
Yeah, very much so. And it was followed by another 7 plus earthquake not long after. And there's been a number of aftershocks as well. So there's been an immense amount of destruction as a result. Yeah, southeastern Turkey is not the most developed part of Turkey, so probably it's not going to have too much of an impact on the economy. But it has done a fair amount of damage. I think the death toll is 3,500 now. That was the last time I checked.
Damn.
Probably go higher. And the last time there were big earthquakes like this in Turkey, it killed something like 16,000. It's quite a few. I've also read that the earthquakes did a lot of damage, the recent ones, that is, in Syria. I was reading that Aleppo had been decimated, which kind of surprised me because I thought it was already decimated from the war. I'm not sure how much more decimation the city could suffer at this point, but apparently whatever there was left to decimate was decimated. Yeah, I
Damn.
think the effect will probably be much worse for Syria than Turkey. Turkey has a stronger, economic base with which to kind of pay for the repairs. Syria, on the other hand, was already just ground into dirt by, 10 years of civil war, economic crises, inflation, like just all of it, all compounding. And now a huge ass earthquake just blows away big chunks of their north. Yeah, Syria just, I can't imagine them getting hammered any worse than they've already been. I couldn't imagine it even before the earthquakes, and then they happened. Like, just how badly hit can a country be?
Yeah. Not rolling the best numbers on luck for sure.
No, no, unfortunately not. Israel's been in the news, but it's not too big a deal. We can save that for some other time. There's been a lot of tit for tat violence in Palestine. I will say this. I've been reading and listening to analysts talk about the situation and status quo in Israel right now, vis-a-vis the conflict with the Palestinians. Everybody, and they themselves have noticed this, everybody is very, very depressed and negative about the outlook. Like I've never seen people, like analysts, just quite so downbeat about the prospects for peace. Like they really have like zero expectations of any positive developments in that conflict.
Sorry, between who?
Israel and Palestine.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's generally bad, but just recent developments over the past year and the nature of the recent violence just has them particularly downbeat.
Mm-hmm.
So I would mention that. What else was there in the EU and then there's been some action in the Middle East, as usual. Iraq has a new government, finally. It took them like a year and a half, but they do actually have a prime minister now. And he's actually fairly pro-American. So that's another win for the United States there. Got some good foreign policy developments for Washington. I'm sure they're pleased about that. But I can talk more about that next time. There's been more drama with the Turkey-Sweden bullshit. Every turn leads to another one. I have no idea how that ends up. And then there's been some drama with Azerbaijan and Armenia. We talked a little bit about that before, but Iran is getting interested in it. Yeah, the Zangezur corridor, which is a bizarre name to me. I'm probably
The
mispronouncing
Gazangazor
it.
corridor? That
Yeah,
rhymes. That's awesome.
yeah, that's a name that you're going to hear more of soon, I suspect.
Mm.
So keep that in mind. That's going to be in the news soon, but we'll talk about that later. And then there's been some violence. Some Turkish troops got targeted by some Iranian-aligned Iraqi militias. That's a whole thing that ties into Turco-Iranian tensions, which is a ongoing nascent development in the region. So stuff going on, worth exploring, but we'll get to it later. Venezuela's got some deals between the opposition and the government that could be good, maybe. And then other stuff that I'm not even. Oh, do you remember Jacinda Ardern,
Jacinda Ardern. The name sounds
Prime
familiar.
Minister of New Zealand?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, she stepped down.
Why?
Just tired, wanted to quit.
That's fair. Well, I've had
It's
enough of
actually
this.
really, it's actually really unusual for, sitting politicians to just be like, I'm done now. Bye.
Mm-hmm.
But she actually did it. So, people have different opinions about it. The more cynical of the commentators that I listened to noted that her popularity was already dipping. She was very popular like when she first came into office. She did a pretty good job of handling the Christchurch shootings back in like 2016, 2017, whatever it was. And there was the big earthquake also. I think that was also Christchurch, if I'm
Mm-hmm.
not mistaken. And then the pandemic hit, and so people kind of gave her credit for that. But in the years since the pandemic started, the pandemic measures that the government took to try to contain it kind of wore on a lot of people. And there was always conservatives in New Zealand that just kind of didn't like her in general. So her popularity has slid with time.
Mm.
And it may have been that she kind of saw the writing on the wall rather, and decided to just go out on her own terms instead of, fighting some pitched political battle to try to
Mm.
maintain her hold on the party. So that was the pessimistic take. The optimistic take is that she has family commitments. She actually famously gave birth while prime minister, which is another unusual thing for a leader to do.
Mm.
And she's kind of been all about trying to balance her role as a woman with her role as leader of New Zealand. That's kind of part of her brand.
Mm.
So there is some credit being given to her for kind of making the decision to focus on family. That to them is somebody putting their life first before their career, which they encourage.
Mm.
There's also the fact that the job is absolutely exhausting. Being the leader of any country will wear on you. And she herself justified, well, maybe not justified, but explained her decision as just not having enough in the tank. Those were the exact words she used. She said that, the job required a lot of energy, a lot of commitment, and she just didn't feel like she had enough in the tank anymore to
Mm.
continue to give the job the attention and focus it deserved.
Mm.
And so for that reason, she was going to step down.
Yeah, that does sound pretty hard to birth and raise children while leading a country at the same time.
Yeah, pretty rough,
Yeah.
I have to imagine. So she's on her way out. We'll see who replaces her. I think Labor is set to, I think they have somebody in the Labor Party specifically in mind who they're going to replace her with. But I don't know if he's going to be as popular or charismatic, so they may not be able to win the next election.
Mm.
Remains to be seen. And it's kind of interesting to kind of see her leave, because we actually started this segment around the time that she came to power.
Hmm.
So her term in office pretty much correlates almost perfectly with us.
How long is the term limit for New Zealand Prime Minister?
I don't think they have term limits because I think they have a parliamentary system,
Mm.
and I don't think they have any kinds of restrictions in that vein. So she could have stayed on longer. She could have been like Thatcher. Thatcher was around like 10 years. I think maybe even a little bit longer.
Oh yeah, there isn't one, but they have to win the election every 3 years.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, Ardern, hypothetically, given, her relative popularity, she still was relatively popular. She could have held on. And
Mm-hmm.
from what I read, a lot of political observers were surprised that she left because they had expected her to stay on. They thought that she would be able to hang on for a pretty considerable while.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, she surprised everybody and announced that she was stepping down.
Mm-hmm.
So just an unusual occurrence in the world of politics, somebody stepping down before they needed to. What a concept.
Yeah. Yeah, it is kind of refreshing in one sense, though, that the person is thinking about it as a role of public service rather than one of amassing power for one's own ego or legend, which I think a lot of people in that height of a position, like if you're the prime minister, or you're the president, or you're somewhere that's pretty close to the top of the hierarchy, you get a lot of types who really like that power and want to maintain and expand it. So when you have people who take it up humbly and then let go of it humbly, that's always a breath of fresh air in a way.
Yeah, that was also a common theme in the commentary. Even among the people that were disappointed to see her go, appreciated that she wasn't clinging to power, unlike certain former mayors of London I could name.
Is this a Boris Johnson joke? Who are we talking about?
That's correct. It is a Boris Johnson
Yes.
joke.
Man, I wish he would have followed through with the I'll be back thing. That would have been really funny.
Well, there's time yet. You never know.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe he'll have a rip-roaring comeback in a couple years.
Yep.
You want some fun trivia?
Sure.
Talking about Boris Johnson reminded me of this. And I'm not blaming Boris Johnson for this, but I just happened to remember it. The way the British economy is going, the average standard of living is set to be on par with Slovakia within 2 years.
Is that
And that's not because Slovakia is getting better.
oh? Is it just that it's hard for people to get wages and they don't have as many services and stuff?
The economy is stagnating. That's the main reason. And there's been a severe lack of investment for a very prolonged period of time.
Oh, because other
You know,
countries don't want to invest there.
it's not that they don't. There are countries and companies that invest in Britain, but it's not nearly enough.
Mm-hmm.
Like given the size of the UK's economy, the investment is surprisingly low. You would expect it to be higher. I think part of the issue is geopolitical risk. Brexit really didn't help with that. Probably investment was one of the biggest victims of Brexit because
Mm-hmm.
there was already a lack of growth opportunities that attracted investment in Britain. But then Brexit happened, and that created a lot of uncertainty. So between a lack of opportunities and uncertainty, yeah, that's a big deterrent to
Mm-hmm.
investment, especially foreign investment.
If they figure out that Brexit didn't actually work, do you think they would try for a re-entry after doing a referendum?
It's possible. There's still a lot of support for the European Union in the UK,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think it's going to be feasible in the
Mm-hmm.
long run. I mean, for one, like flat out, if the UK reapplied today, France would say no. Like, I really don't think France would let them back in.
Mm-hmm.
I think they would exercise their veto. Because France was pretty skeptical about letting the UK in back in the 70s in the first place,
Mm-hmm.
when they first joined. And it took some convincing to get them on board. And after that, basically all of the worst nightmares of the French government happened. The UK cooperated with the United States. They were very skeptical about building up the EU as an institution. They were basically a roadblock to the vision that France had for the development of Europe as a unified entity.
Mm-hmm.
So now here comes Brexit, which is this golden opportunity that removes the principal block that France has in the European Union. I don't think they're going to let that go easily.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect they're going to try to take the opportunity and make it and use it for everything it's worth. So most likely the UK is out for good, I suspect. That doesn't mean that there cannot be a lot more cooperation. The Brexit deal that Britain negotiated was pretty close to a hard Brexit in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So they could negotiate a trade treaty with the European Union that is much better, that gives the UK much more access to the single market in the European Union and aligns regulations and whatnot a lot more, such that they are not nearly as much of a barrier as they are right now.
Mm-hmm.
So de facto reintegration into the European Union is possible, but actually rejoining it is probably off the table for
Mm-hmm.
the foreseeable future.
Hmm. We'll have to keep an eye on what becomes of that, but it's not good to hear that things are in a downward trend.
Yeah, it's not great. And successive British governments have really struggled with that. Like, even when Labour was last in power with
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Prime Minister Gordon Brown, what a name. It's a name bland enough to match the man's politics. Like, he just couldn't do anything. Gordon Brown tried to create little schemes here and there, and they didn't work. That opened the door to, what was his name? The conservative guy that came in after him. Corbone? Not Corbyn, that's the Labour guy. I forgot his name. It's been so long. He was in power for a while. It started with a C. Anyway, he came in. He had this scheme where there was apprenticeships. That was his government's big idea, apprenticeships. And the idea was that it would kind of reduce the barrier to entry to the market, create more opportunities for workers who had weaker educational backgrounds, and it would give an opportunity for, companies to train the labor they needed instead of just importing it.
Mm-hmm.
And none of it worked. Like there was some interest, there was some companies that participated, but by and large, it just didn't go anywhere. And beyond that, there was no like substantive plan to address economic difficulties. Austerity was the big plan that they had, but that was because of the financial crisis, that squeezed the budget. They basically had to cut the budget to try to get within their means. It didn't help that they had a bunch of pre-existing debt too. And that was weighing them down even before the financial crisis. But then Brexit happened, and of course, he had to leave. And so then he was replaced by, this sort of circus of prime ministers that came after Theresa May, Boris Johnson, uh, the bird lady, what's her face? Elizabeth, I can't even remember her name. And then the new guy, Rishi Sunak.
Mm.
So they've all come in and they've all had their own plans, and just there's nothing to them. Like there's just no substance. Like Britain, what Johnson had the leveling up thing, but there was no real follow up. Like there was nominal investment in industrial policy that would target the poorest regions of the UK, but there was no real follow through.
Mm.
And even Labour in opposition has no real plan beyond trying to nationalize the trains or whatever. Like the fundamental problem is that productivity in the British economy is stagnating. There's a lack of investment opportunities, right? There's a lack of things to invest in, or at least there's a lack of enough things to invest in to power growth in the economy. And there's a lot of geopolitical uncertainty surrounding Brexit and how Britain is going to relate to the rest of Europe. Like all of that needs to be resolved, but nobody really knows how to resolve that. Like a lot of that is a structural problem. And economists are not very good at solving structural problems. Like we don't know how to snap our fingers and improve productivity. It just economies don't work like that.
Mm.
So most likely, whatever drama is playing out within the British economy is just going to have to play itself out over the long run and then reach some new equilibrium. Like, I don't think this is something that Britain is going to be able to Thatcher its way out of. Like in the 70s, the British economy was stagnating and it kind of had similar problems in many ways. And then they kind of deregulated the economy and they were able to use the financial sector as an engine that could drive economic growth. But that only gets you so far. Like, you can't deregulate your way to perpetual growth. There's only so many regulations you can remove. So there are some things that they could do in that regard, but most likely they're gonna hit a wall. Like I don't think liberalization is the solution, but I don't think greater state intervention really is going to solve it either. So like they're just sort of stuck. Like probably austerity is going to be their economic future because they built up an immense amount of debt in the pandemic, but they haven't been able to generate enough growth to pay it off. So most likely they're just going to have to cut services, which is going to make the economic problems worse. Right? That was well established during the Eurozone crisis. You can't austerity your way to economic growth. That's not how that works. So, yeah, they're kind of screwed. Like, there is one of the items that I was going to talk about today. It's on my list here. We didn't get to it, but it had to do with regulations. Like, there's a whole shit ton, about 4,000 or so European Union laws that were passed by the European Union Commission that by default became law in the UK. But what happens to those laws when the UK leaves the European Union? So the agreement they made is to keep them on the books for a while, but that eventually they would either have to be codified as British law or they would be scrapped. And successive conservative governments now have been leaning towards just scrapping them. So you could see that as a massive one-off deregulation of the economy if they actually do follow through with that. There's been some drama about that. Labor obviously hates that. They want to codify the laws because they don't want to just completely open up the economy like that. Uh, and then, of course, regional governments in the UK don't want it because a number of the laws in question actually relate to areas that they are responsible for. And they would like the British government to devolve power of regulation over those to the regional governments. As is, London is just ignoring both, and they're kind of moving forward with the plan to just drop the regulations, although they're going to keep some, I suspect. Now, that could generate some growth in the economy, but I doubt it's going to be enough to solve their fundamental productivity problem. Like, in order to really take advantage of that, they would have to attract a lot more investment. They would probably have to sign a bunch more free trade deals that would significantly open up their economy, but they don't want to do that either, I've noted. If you really want a genuine expansion of free trade, you're going to have to open up the British economy to a lot of cheap imports. And that's going to be very disruptive to a lot of traditional producers. Probably a lot of the same producers who voted for Brexit. So the political economy there just does not work. Like Britain has just backed itself up into such a political economic corner that I really have no idea how they're going to get out of it. Whatever the solution ends up being, it's either going to be pretend to do stuff while actually doing nothing and just letting the problem work itself out, or some weird, bizarre shit is going to happen that people could not have predicted that has some unforeseen impact that resolves the issue. Those are basically the only paths forward at this point that I can see.
Yeah, kind of all going back to that holding a referendum seems like a nice idea at the time, but if you get super close to 50-50, it's just going to be a disaster.
Well, let's be fair here. Like Brexit did damage, right? It created barriers to trade that did not need to exist, that were not there before. That has been a problem. But the productivity problem, the investment problem, those problems go back like 20, 30 years.
Mm.
Those problems are not new. Like I said, successive administrations had been struggling with those problems, and none of them succeeded. And the longer the problems went unresolved, the worse they got. Like the more economic growth that the Britain de facto had to give up because it failed to resolve those issues. Like the British economy would be way larger now if 20 years ago they had solved this issue and had managed to generate substantive economic growth, attracted substantive investment, and improved productivity. But they didn't. And as a result, there's an immense amount of opportunity cost that has been incurred.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I don't know how they could have solved it, and I don't know how they're going to solve it. But that problem, and those problems, those are much more relevant to the economic difficulties Britain is facing than Brexit.
Mm-hmm.
Brexit was a one-off shock, but by and large, the economy has adapted to it. You know, it's mostly a services sector economy anyway, and a lot of the services sector was not that impacted by the erection of trade barriers to the European Union.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of the trade barriers that the European Union removed were trade barriers relating to tangible goods. You know, stuff like coal, steel, which was like the original impetus of the European Coal and Steel Commission, the predecessor to the European Union. But then also stuff like cars, car parts, etc. You know, the tangible part of the economy, the manufacturing side of the economy, was really the part of the economy that European trade barriers, which were removed by the European Union, were really inhibiting. So that's what really hurt Britain then, right? Mm-hmm. But the manufacturing sector in Britain has been in decline for decades. So even though the sector was disrupted, its disruption was not so impactful to the British economy as to really explain the economic difficulties of the country as a whole. I would certainly ascribe Brexit to the difficulties faced by the primary sector. That is to say, agriculture, food processing, etc., fishing especially, was really hit hard by Brexit. So, you know, those industries, of course, very much impacted by Brexit. And there are parts of the services sector that were impacted, like musicians who used to be able to travel very easily into Europe, now find it more difficult. But those are pretty niche areas of the economy. Like agriculture doesn't employ very many people. Like a lot more people are employed in the services sector. So because the services sector was not that disruptive, Brexit's damage was mitigated. You know, it was insulated, if you like, from the worst of the disruption. And I would point out, too, that the British government went out of their way to negotiate for carve-outs in their agreements with the EU regarding specifically the automotive sector and the finance sector. And those are some of the biggest employers in Britain. So the damage to the manufacturing sector was not focused on the biggest employer in the manufacturing sector, the automotive sector. It was focused on other elements within the manufacturing sector. So that's another reason that the damage was inhibited. So all told, don't blame Brexit for the UK's economic woes. You can blame it for a dip in the economy and for probably creating a structural opportunity cost that's going to be paid in economic growth over decades. But really, the much bigger problem was pre-existing, and that's the biggest problem the UK government is facing.
Right. So it's the consequence of a series of systematic changes over decades rather than an abrupt shift that caused them to change tack and then suddenly have new problems. It's sort of like it put their problems into a more obvious light by virtue of trying to also shift gears.
Yeah. Yeah, it just compounded pre-existing problems.
That makes sense. Well, cool. Appreciate you giving us a nice full Agent Smith session on a off day. I know you have to get to bed here to do your civic duty and save the good people of Dallas and making the right decision, unless they decide that you're not the right juror for the case. But appreciate your expertise as always, and thank you, chat, for contributing to the conversation. As a reminder, we are open to feedback, criticism, and scathing reviews. So if you want to leave us a YouTube comment, just let us know what we got wrong, and we'll try to compare that with the available information and try to be on the right page with stuff. But thank you, Mr. Agent Smith, for your time, and we will see you on the next episode of Well Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again for hosting. Much appreciated. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
See you later. GG. Nice.